$28 million helicopter sits silent in a gleaming hangar while a CEO's fury echoes off steel walls. Years of failure, billions at risk, careers crumbling. In a moment of cruel desperation, she turns to the invisible man with the mop, the janitor everyone ignores, and throws him a challenge meant to be a joke. You think you can do better? Fly it. The executives laugh, the cameras roll. But when the old man sets down his mop and walks toward the cockpit, something shifts in the air. What happens next will shatter everything they thought they knew about power, worth, and the people they've overlooked. If you want to see how this impossible moment unfolds, how a single challenge exposes years of hidden truth, stay with me until the very end. And please, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The hangar smelled like metal, hydraulic fluid, and desperation. Victoria Ashford stood in the center of the cavernous space, her Armani heels clicking against the polished concrete like gunshots. The sound echoed through the silence, a silence that had become all too familiar over the past 3 years. Around her, 27 engineers, executives, and military consultants stood in clusters, their expensive suits and crisp uniforms creating a sea of pressed fabric and nervous energy. And in the middle of it all, gleaming under the harsh LED lights like a monument to failure, sat the AH-7 Wraith. The helicopter was beautiful in the way that only cutting-edge military technology could be. All sleek curves and aggressive angles, matte black composite materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The rotor blades, folded back in their resting position, looked like the wings of some predatory bird. Every surface whispered of speed, stealth, and lethality. $28 million of whispers, 3 years of whispers, and not a single successful test flight to show for it. Victoria's jaw was so tight her teeth ached. Her perfectly manicured hands were clenched into fists at her sides, the red nail polish like drops of blood against her pale skin. At 46, she'd built Meridian Aerospace from a struggling defense contractor into a billion-dollar powerhouse through sheer force of will and an absolute refusal to accept failure. Until now. Someone explained to me, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, how we are 3 years and $400 million into development, and this machine still can't stay in the air for more than 7 minutes without the stabilization system failing. Nobody answered. The lead engineer, Dr. Marcus Chen, stared at his tablet as if the screen might offer him an escape route. The military liaison, Colonel Sarah Brennan, studied her boots. The VP of Operations, James Whitmore, suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. Marcus, Victoria turned to face him directly. You assured me 6 months ago that the recalibration would solve the oscillation problem. You stood in my office and promised me we'd have a successful test by September. It's December. The mathematics are sound, Victoria, but I don't pay you for mathematics. Her voice cracked like a whip. I pay you for results. The Pentagon has 5 other contractors salivating for this contract. 5. And every single one of them is circling like sharks because they can smell blood in the water. Our blood. Marcus flinched. If we had more time. Time? Time? Victoria laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. We've burned through 17 months of extensions. The Defense Department evaluation is in 6 weeks. 6 weeks! And we have a $28 million sculpture that flies like a drunk flamingo. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the group. Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. You think this is funny? You think your stock options are going to be funny when this company tanks? When you're all out on the street explaining to your next employer why the biggest military contract in a decade went to Northrop or Lockheed instead of us? The laughter died instantly. James Whitmore cleared his throat carefully. Victoria, perhaps if we approach the stabilization from a different angle, the issue might not be the gyroscopic system itself, but the integration with, I don't want theories. Victoria spun toward him. I want someone to get in that cockpit and fly this thing properly. Just once. One clean flight. That's all I need. One perfect demonstration to show the Pentagon that we haven't wasted their advance funding on an over-engineered paperweight. The test pilots have all reported the same issues, Colonel Brennan offered quietly. The oscillation creates vertigo. The controls are hypersensitive. Then get me better pilots, Victoria was practically shouting now. her carefully cultivated corporate composure cracking like thin ice. Get me someone who isn't afraid of a little turbulence. This is supposed to be a combat helicopter. It's going to face hostile fire, not just some wobbling. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the assembled group with undisguised disgust. These people, these highly paid, overeducated, credential-laden professionals who couldn't solve a problem that was literally costing them millions of dollars a month. Her gaze swept across the hangar, past the engineers with their tablets, past the executives with their worried faces, past the observation area where assistants and junior staff clustered nervously. And then her eyes landed on him, an old man in gray coveralls pushing a mop bucket across the far end of the hangar. He was perhaps 70, maybe older, with weathered brown skin and silver hair cropped close to his skull. His coveralls were clean but worn, the kind of practical work clothes that had seen thousands of hours of labor. He moved slowly, methodically, his mop creating neat overlapping patterns on the already clean floor. In 3 years, Victoria had probably seen him 100 times, maybe more. He was always there, always working quietly in the background, emptying trash, cleaning windows, mopping floors, part of the invisible infrastructure of the building, as unremarkable as the fluorescent lights or the climate control system. She didn't even know his name. And suddenly, in her fury and frustration, an idea bloomed in her mind. A terrible idea, a cruel idea, but also, in its own twisted way, a brilliant idea. If she couldn't motivate her team with reason or money or fear, maybe she could do it with shame. You know what? Victoria's voice had changed. There was something dangerous in it now, something sharp and cold. Maybe we're going about this all wrong. Maybe we don't need more engineers or better pilots. Maybe what we need is some fresh perspective. Marcus looked up warily. What do you mean? Victoria pointed across the hangar. Him, the janitor. What's your name? The old man stopped mopping. He looked up slowly, his dark eyes calm and unreadable. For a moment he didn't respond, as if he couldn't quite believe she was addressing him. I asked you a question, Victoria said. Your name? Jackson, ma'am. His voice was deep and quiet, with the faint trace of a southern accent. Frank Jackson. Frank Jackson. Victoria smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd just spotted prey. Frank, how long have you worked here? 3 years, ma'am, since the building opened. 3 years? So you've been here since we brought the Wraith in. You've seen every test, every failure, every expensive disaster, haven't you? Frank set his mop against the bucket carefully. I've seen some things, yes, ma'am. Victoria walked toward him, her heels clicking with each step. The entire hangar watched this bizarre interaction unfold. Several people had their phones out now, recording. This was going to make one hell of a story at the holiday party. Tell me something, Frank. In your expert janitorial opinion, what do you think is wrong with our helicopter? There were a few snickers from the assembled executives. James Whitmore covered his mouth to hide a smile. Even Marcus looked relieved that Victoria's anger had found a new, harmless target. Frank looked at her steadily. I wouldn't know about that, ma'am. I just cleaned the floors. Oh, but you must have some thoughts. You're here all the time. You probably know this hangar better than anyone. Better than our engineers, certainly, since they can't seem to solve a simple stabilization problem. Victoria's voice was heavy with sarcasm. So please, share your wisdom with us. What would you do differently? The mockery was obvious now. Several people were openly grinning. Someone whispered something, and laughter rippled through the group. Frank stood there, his weathered hands resting on the mop handle. He looked old, tired, and completely out of place among all these educated professionals in their expensive clothes. I'm just the janitor, ma'am, he repeated quietly. Exactly. Victoria spread her arms wide, her voice rising. Just the janitor, a man with a mop. No engineering degree, no flight training, no expertise whatsoever. And yet I'm willing to bet that even you could do a better job than the so-called experts I've wasted millions paying. The laughter was louder now. This was entertaining, the Ice Queen CEO losing it on the janitor. People were definitely recording this. In fact, Victoria continued, warming to her theme, I have an idea, a challenge. Frank Jackson, if you think you understand this helicopter so well from mopping around it, why don't you fly it? The laughter stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute. Frank looked at her without speaking. "I'm serious," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "You've had 3 years to observe, 3 years to watch these brilliant minds fail again and again. Surely you've learned something. So here's my offer. You get that helicopter in the air and fly it for 10 minutes without crashing, and I'll give you $100,000 cash." "Victoria, this is insane," Marcus protested. "He could damage..." "Damage what?" Victoria whirled on him. "A machine that doesn't work? A prototype that's already failed 17 times? What exactly are we protecting here, Marcus? Our pride? Our reputation? Those are already gone." She turned back to Frank. "What do you say, Mr. Jackson? Want to earn $100,000? All you have to do is what our $1 million engineers can't accomplish. Just climb in, start it up, and fly." James Whitmore was grinning openly now. "This is the best thing I've seen all year." "Someone's recording this, right?" another executive asked. "This is gold." Victoria held out her hand toward the helicopter, like a game show host presenting a prize. "Well, Frank? Or are you going to admit that maybe, just maybe, flying a cutting-edge military helicopter is a bit more complicated than mopping floors?" She was giving him an out, a chance to back down, to acknowledge his place, to confirm what everyone in the room believed, that some people were meant to lead and innovate, while others were meant to clean up after them. Frank looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. Then he leaned his mop against the wall. "All right," he said quietly. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. "What?" Victoria blinked. "I said all right, ma'am. I'll fly your helicopter." The laughter came back, louder than before. This was perfect. The crazy CEO and the delusional janitor. This video was going to go viral inside the company. "Frank, buddy, I don't think you understand," James started. "I understand fine." Frank began walking toward the Wraith. His gait was steady despite his age, his shoulders straight. "You want me to fly this aircraft for 10 minutes without incident. That's the challenge." Victoria watched him approach the helicopter, a mixture of shock and anger warring in her chest. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He was supposed to back down, to be humiliated, to make her engineers feel grateful they weren't him. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered. "We should stop this before..." "Before what?" Victoria snapped. "Before he exposes himself as incompetent? Let him! Let everyone see what happens when you overestimate yourself. Maybe it'll be a lesson for all of us." But there was something in Frank's movements that was starting to bother her. He wasn't shuffling or hesitant. He moved with purpose. When he reached the Wraith, he didn't stop to gawk at it or look confused. He walked straight to the pilot side door and opened it with familiar ease. Has he opened that before?" Colonel Brennan asked quietly. "He cleans in here," someone offered. "He probably knows where things are." Frank climbed into the cockpit. Not struggled, not fumbled, climbed, smoothly, efficiently, like someone who'd done it 1,000 times. He settled into the seat and reached for the harness. The 4-point harness clicked into place with practiced precision. Victoria felt the first flutter of unease in her stomach. "Someone should really stop this," Marcus said, but he didn't move. Frank's hands moved across the control panel. Not randomly, not searching. He flipped 3 switches in quick succession, and the Wraith systems hummed to life. Displays lit up. The main computer began its startup sequence. "How does he..." James trailed off. Frank reached overhead and adjusted the collective pitch. Then he tested the cyclic, moving it through a small range of motion. His movements were economical, professional. "Victoria," Colonel Brennan's voice was sharp now. "I think we should..." "Wait." Victoria held up her hand. She was staring at Frank, really looking at him for the first time. The way he sat in the cockpit, the way his hands knew exactly where every control was, the calm, focused expression on his weathered face. This wasn't a janitor playing pretend. This was something else entirely. Frank pulled on the flight helmet that had been resting on the co-pilot's seat. It fit perfectly. He adjusted the mic and ran through what sounded like a pre-flight check, his lips moving silently. "Engine start sequence," he said, and his voice came through the hangar's communication system, clear and authoritative. "Turbine 1. The first engine coughed, then caught. then roared to life with a deep, powerful sound that vibrated through the hangar floor. Turbine 2. The second engine joined the first, and suddenly the Wraith was alive, both turbines spooling up, the rotor blades beginning their slow rotation overhead. Every phone in the hangar was up now, every camera was recording, but nobody was laughing anymore. "This is insane," Marcus whispered. "He's actually going to try to fly it." "Oil pressure nominal," Frank's voice continued calmly over the speakers. "Hydraulics green, fuel flow optimal, rotor RPM building to operational speed." He sounded like a pilot, not like a pilot, like a very good pilot. Victoria's mouth had gone dry. "Frank," she said, but her voice came out weak, lost in the noise of the engines. "Generator output stable, avionics online, flight control system initialized." Frank's right hand rested on the cyclic, his left on the collective. His feet were positioned on the anti-torque pedals with the easy confidence of long familiarity. "Someone stop this!" Marcus shouted, but it was too late. The Wraith lifted off the ground. It rose smoothly, steadily, with none of the wobbling or oscillation that had plagued every previous test. 1 foot, 2 feet, 5 feet, 10. The landing skids cleared the safety markers on the floor, and still the helicopter rose, perfectly balanced, perfectly controlled. 20 feet up, Frank brought the Wraith into a stable hover. The hangar was silent except for the thunder of the turbines and the rhythmic whop, whop, whop of the rotor blades cutting through the air. Victoria stared upward, her hand pressed to her mouth. "That's impossible," James breathed. "The stabilization system can't—" Frank banked the helicopter to the left, not dramatically, just a smooth, controlled banking turn that brought the nose around to face the opposite direction. The movement was surgical in its precision. Then he accelerated forward. The Wraith shot across the length of the hangar with startling speed, and Victoria's heart leaped into her throat as she imagined it crashing into the far wall. But 30 feet from impact, Frank pulled back on the cyclic and simultaneously increased collective pitch, bringing the helicopter into a perfect deceleration that stopped its forward momentum exactly where he wanted it. "Stabilization holding," Frank's voice said over the speakers. "Oscillation within acceptable parameters, compensating for minor pitch variation with cyclic input." He was narrating his flight, explaining what he was doing, and worse, explaining it in technical terms that made perfect sense. "Who is this guy?" Colonel Brennan demanded. Frank put the Wraith through a series of maneuvers that Victoria had never seen before. Not from their test pilots, not from the military consultants, not from anyone. He executed a nose-down attitude change that sent the helicopter diving at a steep angle before pulling up smoothly. He performed a pedal turn, using only the anti-torque pedals to spin the helicopter on its axis while maintaining perfect altitude. He even did a sideways translation, moving the entire aircraft laterally across the hangar without changing its facing. Every movement was controlled, precise, professional. And more than that, they revealed something about the Wraith that none of the previous flights had shown. The helicopter could do things, aggressive things, combat things. In Frank Jackson's hands, the Wraith wasn't a temperamental prototype that could barely stay airborne. It was a weapon. It was fast, maneuverable, and absolutely lethal looking as it carved through the air. "Look at the stabilization system," Marcus said, his eyes glued to his tablet. "He's not fighting it. He's working with it, using the oscillation instead of trying to suppress it." "How long has he been up?" someone asked. 8 minutes, James whispered, checking his watch. 8 minutes, without a single error. Frank brought the Wraith back to center, hovering at exactly 15 feet. Then, and Victoria would never forget this moment, he performed a maneuver that she'd only seen in combat footage from overseas. He dropped the collective completely while simultaneously kicking the tail around with the pedals, sending the helicopter into a controlled auto-rotation spin. The Wraith descended rapidly, rotating on its axis, the maneuver designed to avoid ground fire while descending quickly to a landing zone. 5 feet from the ground, Frank arrested the descent with a perfectly timed collective pull, and the Wraith settled onto its skids as gently as a falling leaf. The engines wound down, the rotors began to slow, and in the sudden relative quiet, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Frank Jackson unbuckled his harness, removed his helmet, and climbed out of the cockpit with the same easy efficiency he'd shown climbing in. He walked back across the hangar floor to where his mop and bucket waited. Victoria watched him approach. Her mind was reeling, trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Around her, 27 professionals stood in shocked silence, their phones still recording, their mouths hanging open. Frank picked up his mop. 10 minutes and 47 seconds, he said quietly. No incidents. Helicopter's in perfect condition, same as when I started. Will that be cash or check, ma'am? Who are you? Victoria's voice came out as barely a whisper. Frank looked at her with those calm, dark eyes that suddenly seemed to contain depths she'd never noticed before. Like I said, ma'am, just the janitor. Been cleaning floors for 3 years. Watching, listening, paying attention to things.
No janitor flies like that, Colonel Brennan stepped forward, her military bearing sharp with suspicion and something else. Recognition. I've seen combat pilots with 20 years of experience who couldn't execute half those maneuvers, so I'll ask you again. Who are you? Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was still calm, but there was something in it now, something that had been absent before. A weight, an authority. My name is Frank Jackson, Colonel Frank Jackson, United States Army, retired. 28 years of service, 3,000 hours flying attack helicopters in combat zones. Another 2,000 hours as a test pilot and instructor at Fort Rucker. I helped develop the flight control systems for the Apache, the Comanche, and about 6 other platforms you've never heard of because they're still classified. The silence in the hangar was so complete that Victoria could hear her own heartbeat. I retired 12 years ago with full honors, Frank continued. My wife got sick, cancer, the kind that takes years to kill you and costs everything you have trying to stop it. We burned through our savings in 18 months, lost the house in 2 years. By the time she died, I was $300,000 in debt from medical bills. His voice remained steady, factual, like he was reciting mission parameters. I took this job 3 years ago because at 71 years old, with a 6-figure debt and no collateral, this was what I could get. Night shift janitor, cleaning floors in a building full of people who looked right through me like I was furniture, and that was fine. I didn't need to be seen. I needed to pay off debt and maybe have enough left over for food. Victoria felt something cold settling in her stomach. But I never stopped being a pilot, Frank said. And I never stopped paying attention. For 3 years, I watched you people struggle with a helicopter that any competent test pilot could have diagnosed in 10 minutes. I listened to your engineers argue about problems that had simple solutions. I saw you waste millions of dollars and thousands of hours because everyone was so focused on the complex possibilities that they ignored the simple realities. He gestured toward the Wraith with his free hand, the other still holding the mop. Your stabilization system isn't broken. It's designed for aggressive combat maneuvering. It creates controlled oscillation to allow faster attitude changes. But your test pilots were trying to fly it like a civilian aircraft, smooth and stable. They were fighting the very thing that makes this helicopter special. All you had to do was train them differently, or ask someone who actually understood combat flight dynamics. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. The oscillation is intentional? Not entirely. There's still a calibration issue in the pitch axis that needs addressing. But yes, fundamentally, you built a scalpel and then complained it wasn't a butter knife. Frank turned back to Victoria. You want to know the worst part, Ms. Ashford? I tried to tell someone 6 months ago. I wrote up a detailed analysis and left it on Dr. Chen's desk. Explained the flight dynamics, suggested modified training protocols, even drew diagrams. Marcus's face had gone pale. The janitor's note, I thought it was a joke. I threw it away without reading past the first page. I know, I saw you do it. Frank's expression didn't change. That's when I stopped trying. If you wanted to waste your money and your time, that was your choice. I had floors to mop. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria realized her hands were shaking. 3 years. 3 years this man had been invisible to her. 3 years of assuming that the person pushing the mop was just nobody, nothing, background noise in her important, high-stakes world. And he'd been a colonel, a decorated pilot, a man who'd helped design the very systems she'd spent fortunes trying to perfect. Why didn't you say something? She demanded, and even as the words left her mouth, she knew how stupid they sounded. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Frank's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile. Something sadder. "Ms. Ashford, I applied for an engineering position here 3 years ago. Sent in my resume with my full military record, my test pilot certifications, everything. Your HR department rejected me without an interview. The feedback said I was overqualified and outside the target demographic." Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. "I was 71 years old," Frank continued, "black, applying for a technical position in a company run by 40-something executives. I checked every box for discrimination without anyone having to admit it, so I applied for the janitorial position instead. At least that job didn't care how old I was or what I looked like. Just needed someone to clean." He looked around the hangar at all the phones, all the recording devices, all the shocked faces. "You asked me to fly your helicopter as a joke, to humiliate me, to make your engineers feel better about their failures by comparison. And I did it because I'm tired. I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of watching people fail because they're too proud to listen. And mostly, I'm tired of pretending that mopping floors is all I'm good for just because the world decided my experience doesn't matter anymore." Victoria felt tears stinging her eyes. Shame. Hot, burning shame, like she hadn't felt since childhood. "Frank, the helicopter works fine, Ms. Ashford. You just needed someone who knew how to fly it properly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a spill in conference room B that needs addressing." He turned and began pushing his mop bucket toward the exit. "Wait!" Victoria's voice cracked. "Frank, please wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words felt inadequate even as she spoke them. "I'm so sorry for all of it. The way I spoke to you, the assumptions, I don't need your apology, ma'am." Frank's voice was quiet. "I need my paycheck every 2 weeks. That's all I've ever needed from this place. What if I could offer you something better?" The words tumbled out before Victoria had fully formed the thought. "What if I offered you a position on the flight test team? Or the engineering department? You clearly know more about this helicopter than anyone in this building. I'm 74 years old, Ms. Ashford. I don't care if you're 104. You just proved you're worth more than every so-called expert I've been paying. Name your price, name your position. I'll make it happen." Frank stood there for a long moment, his back still to her. When he finally turned around, his expression was unreadable. "You want me to help fix your helicopter, save your contract, make you look good to the Pentagon. That's what this is about. Not about treating people with dignity. Not about recognizing value regardless of job title. Just about winning." "No, that's not..." Victoria stopped. Was it? Even now, was she just trying to turn this disaster into a victory? Use him the same way she'd tried to use him as a punchline? "Ms. Ashford, you have a room full of talented people, smart people who could have solved this problem months ago if they'd been willing to listen to ideas from unexpected places. Your problem isn't lack of expertise, it's lack of humility." He gestured to the assembled executives and engineers. Every person in this hangar was so focused on their credentials, their positions, their importance, that they couldn't imagine that a janitor might know something valuable. And because you created a culture where only certain people's voices matter, you wasted millions and nearly destroyed this project. Victoria looked around at her team. Marcus wouldn't meet her eyes. James was staring at his shoes. Colonel Brennan looked thoughtful but troubled. "You want to fix your helicopter?" Frank asked. "Start by fixing your culture. Start by actually listening to people. All people. The young engineer who's afraid to speak up in meetings. The technician who's been doing this work for 20 years but doesn't have a degree. The guy mopping the floors who used to design the systems you're struggling with." He paused. "And maybe, just maybe, start by paying people what they're worth instead of what you think you can get away with. I make $18 an hour cleaning your floors. The kid who empties the trash cans makes 15. Meanwhile, you're in here crying about millions in failed tests." The words were a challenge, an indictment, a mirror held up to everything Victoria had built. "If I accept your offer," Frank said slowly, "it won't be as a special exception. It won't be as the token old guy you bring in to fix one problem. It'll be as part of a real change in how this company operates. Fair wages across the board, real respect for every position, and actual accountability starting from the top. Victoria took a deep breath. Her mind was racing. What he was asking for would require board approval, budget reallocation, a complete shift in company culture and philosophy. It would be expensive, complicated, difficult. It would also be right. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Yes, okay. You're hired. Not just as a consultant or a temporary fix, as..." "What? Director of Flight Operations? Chief Test Pilot? You tell me what position makes sense and what salary you need, and I'll make it happen." "And the other changes?" "We'll start with an immediate audit of all wages and positions. I want to know who's being underpaid and by how much, and I want a plan on my desk in 2 weeks for bringing everyone up to fair market value." Frank studied her carefully. "You understand this will cost millions? Less than we've wasted on failed tests because we were too proud to listen. Less than we'll lose if this contract falls through." Victoria met his eyes. "And more importantly, it's what we should have been doing all along." For the first time since this whole surreal encounter began, Frank smiled. It was a small smile, tentative but genuine. "Then we have a deal, Ms. Ashford." He extended his hand and Victoria shook it. His grip was firm, calloused from years of work both in cockpits and with cleaning equipment.
Around them, the assembled crowd began to react. Some applauding, some still too shocked to move, some clearly calculating what this meant for their own positions and futures. Victoria raised her voice to address them all. "I want everyone to think very carefully about what just happened here. We were about to lose everything because we couldn't see what was right in front of us, because we made assumptions based on appearances and positions instead of actual knowledge and skill." She gestured to Frank. "Colonel Jackson, because that's how I'm going to think of him from now on, just saved this project. Maybe saved this company. Not because he's smarter than all of you, but because he was willing to see clearly what we'd all missed. And he could only do that because he wasn't invested in protecting his ego or his position." Victoria turned back to Frank. "When can you start?" "Well, I still have about 4 hours left on my shift, and there's that spill in conference room B." "I'll handle the spill," James volunteered quickly. "Least I can do." "Then I suppose I can start Monday," Frank said. "Give me the weekend to process what I've apparently just agreed to." "Monday it is," Victoria nodded. "And Frank? Thank you. For the flight, for the honesty, for giving us a chance to be better than we've been." "Just doing what needs doing, ma'am. Same as always." He started to turn away again, then paused. "One more thing, Ms. Ashford. When you do that wage audit, pay special attention to the janitorial staff. Most of them are people like me, folks who've had careers and lives before ending up here. They deserve better than poverty wages for keeping this place running." "I will. I promise." Frank nodded once, then walked away, leaving his mop and bucket behind. As the crowd began to disperse, their phones still recording, their minds still reeling, Victoria stood alone near the Wraith and tried to process everything that had just happened. She'd come into this hangar planning to humiliate someone to motivate her team. Instead, she'd been the one humiliated, exposed, forced to confront ugly truths about herself and the company she'd built. And somehow, impossibly, it might turn out to be the best thing that had ever happened to Meridian Aerospace. Colonel Brennan approached her quietly. "That was quite a show." "It was a disaster," Victoria said softly. "Disasters can be opportunities, if you handle them right." Brennan glanced toward where Frank had disappeared. "You know the Pentagon is going to hear about this within hours. Video's probably already circulating." "Let them see it," Victoria said. "Let them see that we were failing because of arrogance, and we're succeeding now because we've finally learned to listen. Maybe that's a better message than pretending we had it all figured out." "Maybe." Brennan smiled slightly. "I'll be interested to see what Colonel Jackson can do with a real budget and actual authority. Man flew that bird like he was born in it." "He probably was, in a way." Victoria sighed. "All those years of experience, all that knowledge, and we had him mopping floors." "Not anymore." "Not anymore," Victoria agreed. As she walked out of the hangar, she could already feel the weight of what she'd set in motion. The conversations with the board, the restructuring, the inevitable pushback from executives who liked things the way they were. It was going to be hard. It was going to be expensive. It was going to be worth it. Behind her, the wraith sat silent once more, but now it represented something different. Not failure, not wasted money. Potential, properly recognized, finally unleashed. And all it had taken was a janitor with a mop and the courage to accept an impossible challenge. Victoria pulled out her phone and began making notes. Names of people to call, changes to implement, an emergency board meeting to schedule. The real work was just beginning. But for the first time in 3 years, she actually believed they might succeed. Not because they had better technology or bigger budgets, but because they'd finally learned to see the people who'd been invisible all along. The weekend passed in a blur of phone calls, emergency meetings, and increasingly frantic damage control that wasn't really damage control at all, because Victoria wasn't trying to suppress what had happened. She was trying to harness it. By Saturday afternoon, the video had leaked beyond the company. Someone, probably James, though Victoria couldn't prove it, had shared the footage with a defense industry blog. By Sunday morning, it was on LinkedIn, Twitter, and half a dozen aerospace forums. By Sunday night, Victoria's phone was ringing with calls from journalists, competitors, and 3 different Pentagon officials. The message was always the same. Is it true? Did a janitor really fly your prototype? And Victoria's answer, carefully crafted after hours of deliberation, was consistent. A highly experienced retired military pilot who was working in facilities management demonstrated capabilities that exceeded our expectations and revealed flaws in our training protocols. We've hired him to lead our flight operations moving forward. It sounded corporate, sanitized, but it was true enough to avoid being a lie while vague enough to buy her time. Monday morning arrived with the weight of consequence. Victoria stood in her office on the top floor looking down at the parking lot as employees arrived for work. She'd been there since 5:30, preparing. Her assistant had already fielded 17 media requests, and it wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. Her desk was covered with documents, employment contracts, budget revisions, a preliminary wage audit that had made her physically nauseous when she'd reviewed it at 2 in the morning. The disparities were worse than she'd imagined, not just between executives and line workers, but within departments, between genders, between younger and older employees. She'd built this. Every inequity, every assumption, every structural problem could be traced back to decisions she'd either made or allowed. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Ashford, Colonel Jackson is here." Victoria took a breath. "Send him in." The door opened and Frank Jackson entered. He wasn't wearing coveralls anymore. Instead, he wore pressed khakis, a button-down shirt, and a blazer that looked like it had been purchased sometime in the previous decade, but was clean and well-maintained. He moved with the same quiet confidence he'd shown all along, but now Victoria could see it for what it was, the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in command. "Colonel Jackson," she extended her hand. "Thank you for coming in early." "Frank is fine, Ms. Ashford." He shook her hand. "No need to stand on ceremony now." "Then call me Victoria." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit. We have a lot to discuss." Frank settled into the chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had accumulated 74 years of wear and tear. Victoria noticed the way he favored his left leg slightly, the faint tremor in his right hand that he controlled with conscious effort. "How was your weekend?" she asked. "Interesting. Got about 43 phone calls from people I haven't heard from in years. Apparently the video made it to some military veteran forums." Frank's expression was wry. "Old pilots don't die, they just argue about flight dynamics on the internet." "I'm sorry for the intrusion on your privacy." "Don't be. Most of them were happy to see me back in a cockpit. Few of them were surprised I'd been mopping floors. They know how the world works for old soldiers." He paused. "Though I did get one call from my daughter. That was harder." Victoria felt her chest tighten. "You have a daughter?" "2 daughters, actually, and a son. Haven't spoken to any of them in about 8 years." Frank's voice remained steady, but Victoria could hear the pain underneath. "When my wife died and I lost everything, I was ashamed. Didn't want them to see what I'd become. Told them I was fine. Everything was handled. Then I just stopped calling, stopped answering. Cut them out rather than let them see me struggle." "Frank." "My youngest, Sarah. She called Saturday night. Saw the video. Cried for about 20 minutes before she could even speak. Asked me why I didn't tell her. Why I didn't ask for help. He looked down at his hands. Didn't have a good answer for that. Pride, mostly. Stupid old man pride. Victoria sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the story. Are you going to see her? She's flying in from Colorado next weekend, bringing my granddaughter. Haven't met her yet. She's 7. Frank's voice cracked slightly. 7 years old, and I've never even seen a picture because I was too proud to admit I was struggling. I'm glad you'll get to meet her now. So am I. But it's a hell of a way to get there. Being humiliated on camera by a CEO half my age. He smiled slightly. No offense. None taken. I deserve that, and worse. Victoria pulled out a folder from her desk. Which brings us to why we're here. I meant what I said Friday. I want you to lead flight operations, but we need to talk about what that actually means.
Frank leaned forward. I've been thinking about that. You've got a good team, Victoria. Smart people. They just need direction and permission to fail. Permission to fail? Your engineers are terrified of making mistakes. I watched them for 3 years, and every meeting, every test, everyone was so worried about being blamed for problems that nobody wanted to try new solutions. That's not engineering. That's politics. Victoria winced because it was true. She'd created an environment where failure was punished, where covering your ass was more important than solving problems. And it had nearly destroyed the company. How do we fix that? Start by changing how you respond to failure. When the next test goes wrong, and it will, because we're building complex machines, don't look for who to blame. Look for what to learn. Make failure a data point, not a death sentence. Frank pulled out a small notebook from his blazer pocket. I made some notes over the weekend. Hope you don't mind. Not at all, please. Frank opened the notebook, and Victoria saw pages of neat handwriting, diagrams, and calculations. Your stabilization system needs 3 modifications. First, the pitch axis dampening is calibrated for smooth flight, but this aircraft is designed for aggressive maneuvering. We need to reduce the dampening coefficient by about 30% and retune the response curve. Second, your collective pitch control has a dead zone issue in the middle range, probably a software problem in the fly-by-wire system. Third, and this is the big one, your training protocols are teaching pilots to fight the aircraft instead of working with it. He flipped to another page covered in equations. The oscillation everyone was so worried about? It's actually a feature, not a bug. The flight control system is designed to allow rapid attitude changes by briefly reducing stability. It's how the Wraith can execute evasive maneuvers faster than anything else in its class. But if you don't understand that, it feels like the helicopter is trying to kill you. Victoria stared at the notebook. You figured all this out from watching tests? And from flying it? And from reading the technical specifications that your engineers kept leaving on their desks when they went to lunch? Frank shrugged. Janitors are invisible, remember? Nobody thinks twice about us being in rooms when confidential discussions are happening. That's going to change. I know. Part of me will miss the invisibility. You learn a lot about people when they don't know you're listening. But most of me is tired of pretending to be less than I am. He met her eyes. So here's what I need from you. Full authority over flight testing and pilot training. Direct access to the engineering team without going through layers of management. And a budget for bringing in outside consultants. Old military pilots who actually know combat flight dynamics. Done. I haven't told you the salary I want yet. Victoria slid a contract across the desk. I had HR draw this up based on comparable positions at other defense contractors. Director of Flight Operations, $250,000 base salary, performance bonuses tied to project milestones, full benefits including relocation assistance if you want to move closer to the facility. Frank stared at the number. For a long moment, he didn't speak. That's more than I made as a colonel, he said quietly. It's less than you're worth, but it's what our budget can sustain right now. Victoria paused. There's also a signing bonus, $50,000, paid immediately, enough to clear your remaining medical debt with some left over. Frank's hand trembled as he picked up the contract. You looked into my finances. I needed to know what you were carrying. I hope that's not an invasion of privacy. It's practical. I appreciate practical. He scanned the contract, his eyes moving quickly over the legal language. This also includes backdated raises for the janitorial staff, and the maintenance crew, and the junior engineers. That's the start. Full wage audit results will be ready by Wednesday, and we'll begin implementing corrections immediately. It's going to cost us about $12 million over the next fiscal year, but the board approved it Sunday night. They approved it? Just like that? Victoria laughed, and it was a bitter sound. Not just like that. I had to threaten to resign and take the Pentagon contract with me. I had to show them the viral video and explain that our choice was between spending money to fix our culture or spending it on lawyers when the discrimination lawsuits started rolling in. And I had to remind them that Frank Jackson mopping floors while we failed was the perfect symbol of corporate incompetence. So you used me to force their hand. I used the truth to force their hand. You were the proof that everything we'd been doing was wrong. Victoria leaned forward. But I need you to understand something, Frank. This isn't just about good PR or avoiding lawsuits. I meant what I said Friday. I want to build a company where people like you don't have to be invisible, where experience is valued regardless of age, where the person with the mop has as much right to be heard as the person with the corner office. Frank studied her carefully. That's a nice speech. Do you believe it? I'm trying to. Ask me again in 6 months when it gets hard and expensive and people start pushing back. Victoria felt her throat tighten. I've been running this company on fear and hierarchy for 10 years. It worked. We grew. We won contracts. We made money. But we also became a place where people were afraid to speak up, where talent went unrecognized, where success meant not rocking the boat. She gestured at the window overlooking the facility. Friday, you called me out in front of everyone. You exposed my cruelty, my blindness, my arrogance, and you were right about all of it. I don't know if I can completely change who I've been, but I want to try. And I need people like you to hold me accountable when I slip back into old patterns. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled a pen from his pocket and signed the contract. All right, Victoria. Let's see if we can turn this ship around before it hits the rocks. The first staff meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main conference room. Word had spread fast about Frank's hiring, and the room was packed when Victoria and Frank arrived. Engineers, technicians, project managers, even some of the administrative staff had crowded in, wanting to witness what happened next. Marcus Chen stood near the front, looking pale and nervous. James Whitmore leaned against the back wall with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Colonel Brennan sat at the conference table, her military bearing as sharp as ever. The room fell silent when Victoria entered with Frank at her side. Thank you all for coming, Victoria began. I know many of you have seen the video from Friday. I know there are questions, concerns, probably some fear about what happens next. So let me be direct. Everything is changing, starting today. She gestured to Frank. Colonel Frank Jackson is now Director of Flight Operations. He has full authority over all testing protocols, pilot training, and flight system development. His decisions in those areas are final and carry the same weight as my own. There was a murmur through the crowd. A few people glanced at Marcus, whose title had just been effectively superseded. I know this is sudden, Victoria continued. I know some of you are wondering how someone who was cleaning floors on Friday can be running operations on Monday. So let me tell you what I should have known 3 years ago. She proceeded to detail Frank's military record, his experience as a test pilot, his role in developing flight systems for previous helicopter platforms. With each credential, the murmuring grew quieter. By the time she finished, the room was silent again. For 3 years, Victoria said, her voice hardening, we had one of the most qualified helicopter pilots in the country working in this building. And we had him mopping floors because we never bothered to look beyond his job title. Because we made assumptions about who was valuable and who wasn't based on age, appearance, and position. She let that sink in. That ends now. Starting today, we're implementing an open-door policy for ideas from anyone in this organization. I don't care if you're a senior engineer or you empty the trash cans. If you have an idea, a concern, or a solution, you bring it forward and it will be heard. James spoke up from the back. With respect, Victoria, we can't evaluate every random suggestion from every employee. We'd never get anything done. You're right. We can't. Which is why Colonel Jackson is going to establish a review process that's efficient but accessible. But here's the key difference from how we've operated.
We're going to approach every idea with the assumption that the person bringing it forward might know something we don't. Novel concept, I know. A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Frank stepped forward. Let me be clear about something. I'm not here to replace anyone or make enemies. Dr. Chen, your engineering is sound. Mr. Whitmore, your project management has kept us on track even when the technical side struggled. Colonel Brennan, your military insights are invaluable. He looked around the room. But we've all been failing because we stopped communicating honestly. Engineers were afraid to admit they were stuck. Pilots were afraid to report problems that might make them look incompetent. Management was so focused on appearances that they missed the substance. Marcus found his voice. Colonel Jackson, with respect, some of us did raise concerns about the flight characteristics. I personally wrote 3 reports about the stabilization issues. I read them, Frank said, all 3. They were technically accurate. They were also completely wrong in their conclusions. The room tensed. You approached the oscillation as a problem to be eliminated, Frank continued. You never considered that it might be intentional. And you know why? Because you were so invested in being right about your original design that you couldn't see alternatives. Marcus's face flushed. That's not fair. Isn't it? When that janitor, me, left a detailed analysis on your desk explaining the actual flight dynamics, what did you do with it? The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at Marcus. I didn't think it was credible, Marcus said quietly. It was handwritten notes from someone with no credentials. No visible credentials, Frank corrected. You never asked who I was or where my knowledge came from. You just assumed that because I pushed a mop, I couldn't possibly understand helicopter aerodynamics better than you. I made a mistake. Yes. And if I'm going to work here, we all need to be able to admit our mistakes without fear of being destroyed for them. Frank's voice softened. Marcus, your work is genuinely good. The Wraith's design is brilliant, but brilliance without humility is just arrogance. And arrogance gets people killed when they're flying complex machines in combat situations. He turned back to the room. Here's how this is going to work. Tomorrow, we're starting fresh flight tests. I'll be in the cockpit for the first 3 runs, demonstrating the proper technique. Then I'll begin training sessions for all our test pilots, showing them how to work with the aircraft instead of against it. Dr. Chen and his team will observe and take notes. We'll identify the remaining technical issues, and yes, there are some, and we'll fix them together. What about the Pentagon evaluation? Someone called out. We've got 5 weeks. 4 weeks and 6 days, Colonel Brennan corrected. And they're sending a full evaluation team. 3 pilots, 2 engineers, and an acquisitions officer. They're going to put the Wraith through every possible scenario. Frank nodded. Then we have 4 weeks and 6 days to turn this prototype into a combat-ready platform. It's tight, but it's doable if we work together and stop wasting time on politics and ego. Victoria watched the room carefully. Some people looked energized, excited by the challenge. Others looked worried, uncertain about these sudden changes. A few looked openly hostile, clearly resenting Frank's rapid ascent or Victoria's public admission of failure. Change was going to be hard, but at least now they were actually changing instead of pretending everything was fine while the ship sank. One more thing, Victoria added. Starting next week, we're implementing the wage corrections I mentioned. Everyone will receive a letter detailing any adjustments to their compensation. For some of you, it will be significant. For others, it will be minimal. But the goal is to ensure that pay reflects actual value and contribution, not just position or tenure. James pushed off from the wall. Can we afford that? We're already over budget on this project. We can't afford not to, Victoria said firmly. Every dollar we save by underpaying people costs us tenfold in turnover, resentment, and lost productivity. I'd rather run lean at the top than create a permanent underclass at the bottom. Does that include executive compensation? Victoria met his eyes. I'm taking a 20% salary cut, and I'm asking the executive team to consider voluntary reductions as well. That money goes into the wage correction fund. The room erupted in shocked conversation. Taking pay cuts was not something executives did in this industry. That's insane, James said flatly. You'll lose half your leadership team. Then they weren't the right leaders, Frank said quietly, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade. Any leader who won't sacrifice for their people isn't worth following.
The room fell silent again. I spent 28 years in the military, Frank continued. Officers eat last. Officers carry the heaviest loads. Officers take responsibility when things go wrong and give credit when things go right. That's not corporate culture, I know, but maybe it should be. Victoria felt something shift in the room. Not agreement, necessarily, but consideration. People were actually thinking about what he'd said instead of immediately dismissing it. "All right," she said, "we have work to do. Colonel Jackson and I will be available for individual conversations throughout the week if anyone has concerns or questions. Department heads, I need status reports by end of day Wednesday. Everyone else, let's get back to what we do best, building the future of aerospace technology." The meeting broke up slowly, people clustering in small groups to discuss what they'd just heard. Victoria noticed Marcus approach Frank hesitantly. "Colonel Jackson, I owe you an apology for the note, for not taking you seriously, for doing what almost everyone does when they see someone in a service position," Frank finished. "I understand, Dr. Chen. I'm not looking for apologies. I'm looking for collaboration moving forward." "You'll have it." Marcus extended his hand. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. We needed someone who wasn't afraid to tell us we were wrong." They shook hands, and Victoria felt a small knot of tension release in her chest. This might actually work. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and crisis management. The media interest hadn't died down. If anything, it had intensified. 3 different news outlets wanted interviews. 2 labor advocacy groups had reached out praising the wage corrections. One competitor had sent a congratulatory message that barely concealed their schadenfreude at Meridian's very public struggles. By 6 o'clock, Victoria was exhausted. She found Frank in the hangar, standing near the Wraith with a tablet, reviewing technical specifications. "You should go home," she said. "It's been a long day." "Could say the same to you." Frank didn't look up from the tablet. "I'm just reviewing the maintenance logs. Want to understand the full history before we start testing tomorrow." "Find anything interesting?" "Few things. The portside turbine has been running slightly hotter than spec for about 6 months. Probably a fuel flow issue. And there's a recurring warning in the avionics system that everyone's been dismissing as a sensor glitch." "Is it a sensor glitch?" "Maybe. Or maybe it's the sensor accurately reporting a problem everyone wants to ignore." Frank finally looked up. "That's the thing about machines. They don't lie. If something's telling you it's wrong, it usually is." Victoria leaned against the workbench. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Depends on how personal." "Why did you really accept the challenge on Friday? You could have just refused, walked away, kept your head down in your job." Frank was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "You know what the worst part of being invisible is? It's not the lack of recognition. It's not even the disrespect. It's the slow forgetting. Every day you forget a little bit more of who you used to be. You start to believe the story everyone else tells about you, that you're nobody, nothing, just part of the background." He set down the tablet. "I was a colonel. I commanded men and women in combat situations. I tested aircraft that cost more than some countries' GDP. I taught the next generation of military pilots. And then I spent 3 years mopping floors and convincing myself that's all I was good for anymore. Friday, when you threw out that challenge, something in me just snapped. I was tired of pretending, tired of being small, tired of watching people fail at something I could fix because I wasn't allowed to be competent anymore. So I accepted. Not because I wanted to humiliate you, though I'll admit that was a bonus." Victoria winced but let him continue. "I accepted because I needed to prove to myself that I was still who I used to be. That 74 years old and 3 years of mopping floors hadn't erased the pilot, the officer, the man who knew how to lead." "And did it? Prove it, I mean?" Frank smiled slightly. "I won't know until I've been doing this for a while. It's easy to fly a helicopter for 10 minutes. It's harder to rebuild a program and lead a team and maintain standards over months and years. But at least now I have the chance to find out. Thank you for taking that chance with us. Thank you for offering it, even if it took public humiliation to get there." He picked up his jacket. "Now, are you going to go home, or am I going to have to pull rank and order you to rest? You can't pull rank on me. I'm the CEO. I'm a colonel. You're a civilian. Rank always wins." His eyes twinkled with humor.
Victoria laughed, surprised by how good it felt. Fine. Colonel's orders. I'm going home. They walked out of the hangar together into the cool evening air. The parking lot was mostly empty now, just a few cars belonging to the late shift security and maintenance crews. Victoria, Frank said as they reached her car. This thing we're trying to do, changing the culture, valuing people differently, it's going to be harder than fixing the helicopter. You know that, right? I know. People are going to resist. They're going to test you, push back, try to return to the old ways because that's what's comfortable. And some of them are going to leave because they don't want to work in a place that values janitors as much as executives. I know that too. And you're ready for it? Victoria thought about the board meeting on Sunday, about the hostile faces and skeptical questions. She thought about James's barely concealed disdain for the wage corrections. She thought about her own exhaustion and the mountain of work still ahead. No, she admitted. I'm not ready. I'm terrified. But I'm doing it anyway because the alternative, going back to who we were, is worse than any failure we might face trying to be better. Frank nodded slowly. That's a good answer. See you tomorrow, Victoria. See you tomorrow, Frank. She watched him walk to his car, a 20-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear quarter panel, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders like a physical thing. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow they'd start testing again, training again, building again. Tomorrow, all the promises she'd made would start being tested against reality. But tonight, driving home through the quiet streets, Victoria let herself feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the aggressive, competitive hope of winning contracts and beating competitors. Not the desperate hope of salvaging a failing project. Real hope. The kind that came from believing, maybe for the first time, that they were actually trying to do something right instead of just trying to win. She thought about Frank in the cockpit, his weathered hands steady on the controls. She thought about his daughter flying in next weekend, about the granddaughter he'd never met. She thought about the janitors and technicians and junior engineers who'd spent years being invisible, who might finally get to be seen. And she thought about herself, the CEO who'd built an empire on fear and hierarchy, who was now trying to tear it down and rebuild it on something better. It might not work. They might fail spectacularly. The Pentagon might reject the Wraith. The board might revolt. The whole thing might come crashing down. But at least they'd fail trying to be better instead of succeeding at being cruel. Victoria pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at her house. Big, empty, expensive. She'd poured everything into Meridian for 10 years, sacrificing relationships and health and any semblance of balance. Maybe that needed to change too. Her phone buzzed. A text from Frank. Reviewed the maintenance logs. Need to replace the fuel flow sensor in turbine 2 before tomorrow's test. I'll handle it. Get some sleep. She smiled and texted back. Thank you. See you at 0800. 0700. Military time now, remember? 0700. Roger that. Brrr. She got out of the car and walked into her house, already thinking about tomorrow, about tests and training and the long road ahead. But for the first time in years, she was thinking about it with something other than fear and desperation driving her forward. She was thinking about it with purpose, and that made all the difference. The flight test began at 7:15 the next morning, and by 7:30, everyone in the building knew something fundamental had shifted. Frank stood in the hangar briefing area with 8 test pilots gathered around him, 6 from Meridian's team, 2 military consultants on loan from Fort Rucker. These were experienced aviators, men and women who'd logged thousands of hours in everything from Blackhawks to Apaches. And Frank was about to tell them they'd been flying the Wraith all wrong. The first thing you need to understand, Frank said, gesturing to the technical diagram displayed on the screen behind him, is that this aircraft was designed by people who understood combat aerodynamics but failed to communicate that understanding to the people flying it. The result is a machine that feels dangerous when it's actually just different. One of the civilian pilots, a former Navy aviator named Rodriguez, raised his hand. Colonel, with respect, I've flown the Wraith 3 times. It's not different. It's unstable. The oscillation makes it impossible to maintain steady flight. That's because you're trying to maintain steady flight in an aircraft designed for dynamic maneuvering. Frank pulled up a video of his flight from Friday. Someone had captured it from multiple angles, and the engineering team had synced the footage with the Wraith's telemetry data. Watch the oscillation pattern during this banking turn. The video played, showing the Wraith executing a sharp left bank, while Frank's voice narrated the technical details. The telemetry overlay showed the stabilization system deliberately reducing dampening during the turn, allowing faster attitude change, then automatically compensating as the maneuver completed. See that spike in the lateral axis? That's not a malfunction. That's the flight control computer briefly sacrificing stability for agility. In combat, that extra half second of turn time is the difference between evading hostile fire and getting shot down. Rodriguez leaned forward, studying the data. So the system is designed to be temporarily unstable? Controlled instability, Frank corrected. Like a sports car that oversteers intentionally to allow tighter cornering. But if you try to drive it like a sedan, you'll spin out. Same principle here. If you fight the oscillation, you amplify it. If you work with it, you can execute maneuvers that would be impossible in a conventional helicopter. Marcus Chen, watching from the observation area with Victoria, made a note on his tablet. He's right, we designed the system to prioritize maneuverability over comfort, but we never properly documented the operational theory. We assumed pilots would adapt naturally. Bad assumption, Victoria muttered. Down in the briefing area, another pilot spoke up. Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the military liaison team. Colonel Jackson, I flew combat missions in Afghanistan. I understand aggressive flying, but the Wraith's oscillation triggers severe vertigo. That's not just discomfort, that's a safety issue. You're absolutely right, Frank acknowledged. And that's the calibration problem I mentioned. The oscillation frequency is slightly off spec in the pitch axis, which creates a resonance effect that interferes with the inner ear. Dr. Chen's team is working on the fix, but even with that issue, the vertigo is manageable if you understand what's causing it and adjust your visual reference accordingly. He advanced to the next slide, showing a modified heads-up display overlay. This is a new HUD configuration I designed yesterday. It provides real-time oscillation feedback and predictive attitude indicators. Essentially, it shows you where the aircraft is going to be, not just where it is now. That gives your brain the information it needs to compensate for the sensory confusion. The pilots exchanged glances. This was more than just flying technique. This was a fundamental rethinking of how they interfaced with the aircraft. Here's the training plan, Frank continued. I'll fly first, demonstrating the baseline maneuvers. Then each of you will fly with me in the co-pilot seat, talking you through the technique. We'll start with basic hover and translation, then progress to more aggressive maneuvers over the next 2 weeks. By the time the Pentagon evaluation team arrives, I want every one of you comfortable pushing this aircraft to its limits. Rodriguez raised his hand again. Colonel, no disrespect, but you're 74 years old. Are you sure you should be flying combat maneuvers in a prototype helicopter? The question hung in the air. Frank's expression didn't change, but Victoria saw something flicker in his eyes. A brief flash of the same anger he must have felt every day while mopping floors, being dismissed because of his age. That's a fair question, Frank said evenly. I'm 74. I have arthritis in both hands. My reaction time is slower than it was 20 years ago. My vision isn't what it used to be. All valid concerns. He walked to the window overlooking the hangar floor where the Wraith sat waiting. But I've also got 50 years of flying experience. I've logged more combat hours than everyone in this room combined. I've tested aircraft that killed pilots who made single mistakes, and I learned from every close call, every failure, every success. Age takes away speed, but it gives you something more valuable, judgment. He turned back to face them. I'm not asking you to follow me because I'm the fastest or the strongest. I'm asking you to follow me because I know what I'm doing, and I can teach you to know what you're doing. And if you think age disqualifies competence, then you learned the wrong lessons from whatever happened last Friday. The room was silent. Then Lieutenant Kim stood up. I'll fly with you, Colonel. Let's see what this bird can really do. One by one, the other pilots nodded their agreement. Even Rodriguez, though he still looked skeptical. Frank checked his watch. Good. Pre-flight begins in 10 minutes. Rodriguez, you're observing first. Kim, you're up second. Questions? There were none. Victoria watched from above as the briefing broke up and the pilots headed for the hangar floor. Marcus stood beside her, his tablet forgotten. He's magnificent, Marcus said quietly.
I've been trying to explain the stabilization theory to pilots for 6 months, and he just did it in 15 minutes. That's what happens when you combine expertise with humility, Victoria replied. He's not trying to prove he's smarter than them. He's trying to make them better. I should have read that note he left on my desk. Yes, you should have. But we're past that now. What matters is what we do from here forward. Victoria pulled out her phone and checked her messages. 3 from the PR team about interview requests, 2 from board members wanting updates, 1 from her assistant about the wage audit results, and 1 from an unknown number. Ms. Ashford, this is Sarah Jackson, Frank's daughter. Thank you for giving my father his dignity back. Whatever you need from our family to support this, you have it. Victoria felt unexpected tears sting her eyes. She showed the message to Marcus. That's what we're really fighting for, she said. Not just contracts and profits. We're fighting to remember that people matter, that dignity matters, that everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are. Marcus nodded slowly. I'm sorry, Victoria, for my part in creating a culture where that wasn't true. We all played our parts. Now we get to write a different story. She pocketed her phone. Come on, let's watch Frank show us how it's done. They descended to the observation area as Frank completed his pre-flight check. The hangar had filled with spectators, engineers, technicians, administrative staff, even some of the janitorial crew Frank used to work alongside. Everyone wanted to witness this moment. Frank's voice came through the speakers, calm and professional. Pre-flight complete. All systems nominal. Beginning engine start sequence. The Wraith's turbine spooled up with that distinctive deep roar. The rotor blades began their rotation, slowly at first, then building to operational speed. Victoria watched the telemetry displays, seeing the real-time data that Frank was processing as he prepared to fly. Lifting to hover. The Wraith rose smoothly off the ground, and Victoria found herself holding her breath. This was it. The moment of truth. Either Frank's theory about the stabilization system was correct, or they were about to witness a very expensive crash. The helicopter climbed to 20 feet and held position, perfectly stable, no oscillation visible to the naked eye. Oscillation present, but within optimal parameters, Frank's voice narrated, compensating with micro-adjustments on cyclic. The key is to anticipate the oscillation pattern rather than react to it. He demonstrated a slow 360 rotation, the Wraith spinning smoothly on its axis. Notice the slight lag between control input and aircraft response. That's the stabilization system doing its job. If you fight it, you create a feedback loop. If you work with it, it's smooth as glass. Rodriguez, watching from the ground with a headset on, spoke into his mic. Colonel, can you demonstrate the banking maneuver you showed in the video? Copy that. Banking left, 45 degrees. The Wraith tilted smoothly into the turn. On the telemetry display, Victoria saw the oscillation spike exactly as it had in Friday's flight. But Frank was ready for it, his control inputs precisely timed to work with the system instead of against it. You feel that surge? Frank said. That's the system giving you extra rotational authority. Feels wrong if you're not expecting it, but once you understand it, you can use it. He brought the helicopter back to level flight, then immediately executed a rapid nose-down attitude change followed by a climb. The maneuver was aggressive, the kind of evasive action you'd use under fire, and the Wraith handled it beautifully. Holy hell, Lieutenant Kim breathed. I tried that exact maneuver 2 weeks ago and nearly crashed. That's because you pulled back on the cyclic too early, Frank said, apparently hearing her through the open channel. You have to let the nose drop fully before initiating the climb, otherwise you're fighting the momentum. Trust the aircraft. For the next 20 minutes, Frank put the Wraith through every maneuver in the book and several that weren't. High-speed runs across the hangar, rapid altitude changes, pedal turns, sideways translations. Each movement revealed something new about the helicopter's capabilities, and with each successful maneuver, the watching crowd grew more animated. This wasn't just flying. This was artistry. This was a master pilot demonstrating what the Wraith had always been capable of, if only someone had known how to unlock it. When Frank finally brought the helicopter in for landing, the touchdown was so gentle that the skids barely made a sound against the concrete. The turbines wound down, and for a moment there was silence. Then the hangar erupted in applause.
Victoria found herself clapping along with everyone else, and she wasn't alone. Marcus was applauding, the engineers were cheering, even the skeptical Rodriguez had a grudging smile on his face. Frank climbed out of the cockpit and removed his helmet. His face was flushed with exertion, and Victoria noticed his hands shaking slightly. Whether from adrenaline or age or both, she couldn't tell. But the expression on his face was one of pure satisfaction. Lieutenant Kim approached him immediately. "Colonel, I owe you an apology. I've been flying helicopters for 12 years and you just taught me more in 20 minutes than I learned in my entire advanced training course." "Don't apologize," Frank said, his breathing a bit labored. "Just learn. That's all any of us can do. Keep learning, keep adapting, keep pushing ourselves to be better than we were yesterday." Rodriguez stepped forward, extending his hand. "I was wrong, sir. About the aircraft and about you. I'd be honored to train under your instruction." Frank shook his hand firmly. "Then let's get started. Kim, you're up next. I'll talk you through the startup sequence." As the training continued, Victoria slipped away to her office. There was work to be done. The Pentagon evaluation was getting closer every day, and Frank's brilliant flying was only part of what they needed to secure the contract. She found James Whitmore waiting outside her door, his expression troubled. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Victoria unlocked her office and gestured him inside. "What's on your mind, James?" He closed the door behind them and stood with his arms crossed. "This thing you're doing, the wage corrections, the cultural changes, promoting a janitor to director, it's going to destroy us." Victoria sat down behind her desk. "Interesting perspective. Care to elaborate?" "The board is already getting nervous. 3 executives have contacted me privately expressing concerns about your leadership. They think you've lost focus, that you're more interested in social justice than actually running a profitable company." "And what do you think, James?" He paced to the window, looking down at the hangar floor where Frank was now coaching Lieutenant Kim through her first flight. "I think you're making emotional decisions based on guilt. I think you're overcorrecting because a video went viral and you felt embarrassed. And I think you're going to bankrupt this company trying to prove you're not the villain everyone saw on camera." Victoria felt anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Is that all?" "No." James turned to face her. "I think Frank Jackson is a talented pilot, and I'm glad we found him. But making him a director after 3 years of him hiding his qualifications? That's not inspirational leadership. That's desperation. You're gambling our entire future on an old man who lied about who he was for years." "He didn't lie. He applied for an engineering position and got rejected. Then he took the job he could get and did it well while watching us fail." "That's not lying, that's surviving. Call it what you want. The optics are terrible. Half the defense industry is laughing at us. The other half is waiting for us to fail so they can scoop up our contracts." James leaned on her desk. "Victoria, I've been with you for 8 years. I've supported every risky decision you've made. But this is different. You're not thinking like a CEO anymore. You're thinking like someone who got caught being cruel and is trying to buy forgiveness." The words hit hard because there was truth in them. Victoria had felt guilt after Friday's confrontation, crushing, overwhelming guilt that had driven many of her decisions over the weekend. But was that all this was? An emotional overreaction? "You're right," Victoria said quietly. "I did feel guilty. I am trying to be better than I was. But that doesn't make the decisions wrong, James. We were failing before Friday. We'd been failing for 3 years. And we were failing because our culture prioritized ego and hierarchy over results. We were failing because we had technical problems. We had technical problems because our culture prevented us from solving them." Victoria stood up, her voice rising. "Frank Jackson tried to help us 6 months ago, and we threw his analysis in the trash because we couldn't imagine that a janitor might know something useful. That's not a technical failure, that's a cultural failure. And it's a failure I created by building a company where people were valued based on their titles instead of their contributions." James shook his head. "So your solution is to turn everything upside down? Promote janitors, cut executive pay, implement wage corrections we can't afford?" "We can afford it. I ran the numbers. It costs us less than we were wasting on failed tests and inefficient processes. That's not the point. The point is that you're destroying the hierarchy that makes organizations functional. If a janitor can become a director overnight, What's the point of climbing the ladder? What's the point of putting in years of work and earning credentials? Victoria walked around her desk to stand in front of James. The point is that hierarchies should be based on competence and contribution, not just credentials and tenure. Frank didn't become a director overnight. He spent 50 years earning the expertise that qualified him. The fact that he spent 3 of those years mopping our floors doesn't erase everything that came before. You're being naive. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally being honest about what actually creates value in an organization. Victoria softened her tone. James, I understand your concerns, I do, but I need you to trust me on this. We're 4 weeks away from the Pentagon evaluation. If we secure that contract, none of these cultural changes will matter because we'll have the revenue to sustain them. If we don't secure it, nothing else matters anyway because we'll be out of business. James was quiet for a long moment. And if I can't support these changes, then I'll accept your resignation with gratitude for your years of service and a generous severance package. Victoria met his eyes. But I hope you'll stay. I need people who are willing to challenge me, to ask hard questions, to make sure I'm not making emotional decisions. I just need them to do it while believing we can actually be better than we've been. James looked at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll stay, for now. But I'm watching, Victoria. And if this experiment starts costing us contracts or talent, I'm going to push back hard. Fair enough. That's all I ask. He left without another word, and Victoria sank back into her chair. The conversation had been exhausting, but necessary. James represented a significant faction in the company. People who believed in the old ways, who thought hierarchy and traditional structures were the only path to success. Changing their minds would take time and proof. Fortunately, Frank was already providing the proof. Over the next 2 weeks, the transformation was remarkable. Every test pilot who flew with Frank came away converted, their skepticism replaced by genuine enthusiasm for the Wraith's capabilities. The engineering team, working directly with Frank instead of through layers of management, identified and corrected the remaining technical issues with startling efficiency. The pitch axis calibration was fixed in 4 days. The fuel flow problem was resolved in 2. The avionics warning that everyone had dismissed as a sensor glitch turned out to be a legitimate issue with the electrical distribution system. Minor, but potentially catastrophic if left unchecked. Frank caught it because he actually listened when the machine tried to tell him something was wrong. But the technical progress, impressive as it was, paled in comparison to the cultural shifts happening throughout the company. The wage audit results had been distributed, and nearly 40% of employees received compensation adjustments. The changes ranged from small cost of living increases to significant corrections for workers who'd been systematically underpaid for years. The janitorial staff, Frank's former colleagues, saw their hourly wages increase by an average of 38%. The response was immediate and powerful. Productivity increased. Turnover dropped. People who'd been doing the minimum suddenly started taking initiative, offering ideas, staying late to solve problems. It turned out that when you paid people fairly and treated them with dignity, they responded by caring about their work. Not everyone was happy. 3 senior executives resigned, unwilling to accept pay cuts or work in what they called an egalitarian fantasy. 2 departed on good terms with severance. 1 threatened legal action until the company's lawyers showed him the video of Victoria's Friday confrontation and asked if he really wanted that to be part of a public lawsuit. He took the severance. The media coverage continued, but the narrative had shifted. What started as a viral video of corporate cruelty had become a story about redemption and change. Business journals were writing about Meridian's radical cultural experiment. Labor advocates were praising the wage corrections. Even some competitors were quietly watching to see if the approach actually worked. And through it all, Frank Jackson remained focused on the mission, getting the Wraith ready for evaluation. Victoria watched him work and learned more about leadership in 2 weeks than she'd learned in 10 years of running the company. Frank never raised his voice, never pulled rank unnecessarily, never made people feel small for not knowing something. He taught with patience, corrected with kindness, and demanded excellence while making it clear that failure was part of learning. The transformation in the test pilots was especially striking. Rodriguez, the skeptical Navy veteran, became one of Frank's most dedicated students. Lieutenant Kim requested an extension of her military liaison assignment specifically to continue training. Even the civilian pilots who'd initially resented Frank's rapid promotion now sought his guidance on everything from technical questions to career advice. 3 weeks after that fateful Friday, Victoria found Frank in his new office, modest, practical, with large windows overlooking the hangar. He was on the phone, and from the tone of his voice, it was a personal call. "I know, sweetheart. I'm nervous too. No, she's wonderful, smart and funny, just like you said. Saturday afternoon, right? I'll be there. I promise. Love you too, Sarah." He hung up and noticed Victoria in the doorway. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt," she said. "Not interrupting, just confirming plans for this weekend. My daughter and granddaughter are flying in." Frank's expression was a mixture of joy and anxiety. "First time I'll meet Emma. 7 years old and I'm a stranger to her." "You won't be a stranger for long. Kids are good at seeing people clearly." "That's what worries me." Frank managed a small smile. "What if she asks why I disappeared for 8 years? What do I tell a 7-year-old about pride and shame and medical debt?" Victoria sat down across from him. "You tell her the truth, age-appropriate version. You tell her Grandpa made mistakes and lost his way for a while, but he's found it again. Kids understand that better than adults do." "I hope you're right." He gestured to the papers spread across his desk. "Anyway, what brings you by? Please tell me it's not another media request." "Actually, it's good news. The Pentagon moved up the evaluation." Frank's expression shifted instantly to alert focus. "How far up?" 2 weeks from tomorrow. They want to accelerate the timeline because 2 of their other prospects fell through. If we perform well, we could have a contract signed by end of January. 2 weeks. Frank pulled up his training schedule on his computer. "That's tight, but doable. All the pilots are proficient now, and the technical issues are resolved. We just need to decide who flies the demonstration." "I assumed you would." "I'm 74, Victoria. The Pentagon wants to know this helicopter can be flown by regular military pilots, not just old test pilot specialists. I should coach, not fly." "Then who?" Frank leaned back in his chair, considering. "Lieutenant Kim is the strongest technical pilot. Rodriguez has the most combat experience. Either of them could handle it. But this isn't just about competence. It's about telling a story. The Pentagon is sending evaluators who've heard about what happened here, the janitor, the viral video, all of it. They're going to be watching for signs that we're a circus instead of a serious contractor." Victoria felt a chill. "You think the video hurt us?" "I think it made us interesting, which is both good and bad. Good because they're paying attention. Bad because they're looking for reasons to disqualify us." Frank pulled up the evaluation criteria. "They're testing everything: flight performance, system reliability, pilot adaptability, even organizational stability." Organizational stability. That's the part that worries you. 3 executives resigned in 2 weeks. We promoted a janitor to director. We implemented company-wide wage changes during a critical contract period. On paper, that looks like chaos. Victoria felt her stomach knot. "I didn't think about it that way." Most people wouldn't, but Pentagon acquisition officers are paid to be paranoid. They're going to ask hard questions about whether we're a stable long-term partner or a company in the middle of an identity crisis. "What do we do?" Frank smiled. "We tell them the truth. We were in crisis, we recognized it, and we're fixing it. We show them that the changes we've made aren't distractions. They're the reason we're suddenly succeeding." "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. It's just not easy." He pulled out a notebook, the same one he'd shown Victoria that first Monday, and began writing. "We need to prepare a narrative that explains everything clearly: the technical failures, the cultural problems, the breakthrough moment, and the systematic changes we've implemented. We need to own our mistakes instead of hiding them. That's risky. Admitting failure to potential clients. Admitting failure and showing how you fixed it is powerful, Victoria. It demonstrates adaptability, honesty, and competence under pressure, all things the Pentagon values in contractors." Frank looked up from his notes. "Besides, they're going to find out anyway. Better to control the narrative than let them discover it through research." Victoria nodded slowly. He was right, of course. Trying to hide or minimize what had happened would only make it worse when the truth inevitably emerged. "All right," she said. "Let's prepare a full briefing for the evaluation team. Technical specifications, testing results, cultural changes, everything. We'll be completely transparent." "Now you're thinking like a leader." Frank returned his attention to his notebook. "I'll work on the technical presentation. You should prepare to talk about the organizational changes, why you made them, what results you've seen, how they've improved our capabilities." "Me? Shouldn't you present that part?" "Victoria, they need to hear it from you. The CEO admitting mistakes and explaining how she's fixing them carries weight. If I do it, I'm just an employee following orders. If you do it, you're a leader taking responsibility." She felt a flutter of nerves. "I'm not good at that kind of vulnerability." "You're better than you think. You apologized to me in front of the entire company. You've been honest with your board about failures. You're learning." Frank's expression softened. "Besides, being uncomfortable means you're growing. The day this feels easy, that's when you need to worry." Victoria stood up, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to prove that everything they'd been building wasn't just a feel-good story, but a genuine transformation that produced results. "Frank, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you regret it? Taking the challenge that day? Everything that's happened since?" He considered the question carefully. "I regret that it took public humiliation to create change. I regret that people like me have to prove ourselves over and over while others are assumed competent based on credentials alone. I regret the years I lost with my family because I was too proud to admit I needed help." He paused. "But do I regret standing up and showing people who I really am? No, not for a second. Because whatever happens with the Pentagon evaluation, whatever happens with this company, I got my life back. I got to be a pilot again, a teacher again, a leader again. And in 2 days I get to meet my granddaughter, not as some distant relative she's never known, but as someone she can be proud of." His voice grew thick with emotion. "So no, Victoria, I don't regret it. I'm grateful for it, even though the path there was painful for both of us." Victoria felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Thank you. For taking the chance, for teaching us, for being patient with me while I figured out how to be better. We're all figuring it out together. That's what makes it work." Frank smiled. "Now get out of here. You have a presentation to prepare, and I need to finalize training protocols." Victoria left his office feeling steadier than she had in days. 2 weeks. They could do this. They had to. The next 13 days passed in a controlled frenzy of preparation. Every system was tested and retested. Every pilot logged additional training hours. The hangar was cleaned and organized to military standards. Documentation was compiled, reviewed, and refined. Frank worked 18-hour days, and Victoria had to forcibly send him home several times when she noticed him struggling with fatigue. His body wasn't keeping up with his mind's demands, but his determination never wavered. On the Friday before the evaluation, Sarah and Emma Jackson arrived. Victoria watched from her office window as Frank met them in the parking lot. She saw him drop to one knee to be at eye level with the little girl, saw the moment Emma's shyness broke, and she threw her arms around his neck. She saw Frank's shoulders shake with what could only be sobs, and she saw Sarah wrap her arms around both of them. It was a private moment, and Victoria felt guilty for watching, but she couldn't look away. This was what they'd been fighting for, not just contracts and profits, but the restoration of dignity and connection, and all the things that made life worth living beyond work. Her phone rang. It was Marcus. "Victoria, we've got a problem. The port turbine is showing anomalous vibration readings. Nothing critical yet, but it's outside normal parameters." The moment of sentiment shattered. "I'll be right down." She grabbed her jacket and headed for the hangar, her mind already racing through contingencies. They had 3 days. 3 days to ensure everything was perfect. This was it. The moment when all the changes, all the struggles, all the hope they'd built would be tested against the hardest judge of all, reality. And they were out of time to prepare. The turbine vibration turned out to be a loose mounting bolt. Simple fix, 15 minutes of work. But it was a stark reminder that even with all their preparation, machines could fail at the worst possible moments. Victoria stood in the hangar at midnight on Sunday, watching the maintenance crew run final diagnostics, while Frank supervised from a rolling chair because his legs had given out 2 hours earlier. You should be home with your family, Victoria told him. They're asleep at the hotel. I'll see them at breakfast. Frank studied the diagnostic readouts with bleary eyes. Besides, Sarah understands. She grew up with a father who checked aircraft before bedtime like other dads checked door locks. What does Emma think of all this? Frank's tired face broke into a genuine smile. She thinks her grandpa is a superhero. She told everyone at the hotel restaurant that I fly attack helicopters and used to be invisible. 7-year-old logic is interesting. Victoria laughed despite her exhaustion. She's not wrong about the invisible part. No, I suppose she's not. Frank shifted in the chair, wincing. Sarah and I talked for 3 hours last night. Really talked. First honest conversation we've had in almost a decade. How was it? Painful. Necessary. She's angry, not about the money or the struggle, but about me shutting her out. She wanted to help, and I wouldn't let her. Frank rubbed his eyes. I told myself I was protecting her from my problems, but really I was just protecting my ego from admitting I'd failed. The maintenance chief approached them. Colonel Jackson, all diagnostics are green. The vibration was just the mounting bolt working itself loose during high-stress maneuvers. We've secured it and checked every other connection point. She's ready. Thank you, Chief. Frank tried to stand and his legs buckled slightly. Victoria caught his arm. That's it. You're done for tonight. Doctor's orders except, I'm not a doctor. I'm your boss. I don't recall that being in my contract. I'm adding it as an amendment. CEOs can do that. Victoria helped him toward the exit. I'm driving you to your hotel, you're sleeping for at least 6 hours, and tomorrow you're spending the day with your family. The Pentagon team doesn't arrive until Monday afternoon. We have time. Frank started to protest, then seemed to realize he didn't have the energy. Fine. But if anything comes up, then Marcus and the team will handle it. That's what delegation means, Frank. You taught us to trust people. Now you have to actually do it yourself. They walked out to the parking lot in the cool pre-dawn air. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, that deep blue-black that comes before sunrise. Victoria's car was one of only 3 left in the lot. Hers, Frank's ancient Honda, and a security vehicle. I'll have someone drive your car to the hotel later, Victoria said, unlocking her Mercedes. Frank settled into the passenger seat with a groan. This is nicer than my apartment. Your apartment or your car? Both. He leaned his head back against the leather headrest. You know what the strangest part of all this is? I keep waiting for it to fall apart. Keep waiting for someone to realize they made a mistake promoting me. Keep expecting to wake up back in my studio apartment with a mop in my hand. Victoria started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. That's called imposter syndrome. Most competent people have it. Do you? She was quiet for a moment, considering. Every single day. I look around at all these changes we've made and wonder if I'm being brave or just reckless. If I'm a visionary leader or just someone who got embarrassed and overcorrected. And which do you think you are? I honestly don't know yet. Ask me again after tomorrow. Victoria glanced at him. Are you nervous about the evaluation? Terrified. Not about the flying, I know the aircraft is ready, but about everything else. What if they see the cultural changes as instability? What if they think we're a social experiment instead of a serious contractor? What if the story of what happened overshadows the actual capabilities we've developed? Then we deal with it together. Victoria turned onto the highway. Frank, whatever happens tomorrow, you need to know something. These past few weeks, working with you, watching you lead, it's changed me. Not just as a CEO, but as a person. You showed me what real leadership looks like. Victoria, no, let me finish. I spent 10 years building this company on fear and competition and hierarchy. And it worked, in a sense. We grew, we won contracts, we made money, but we were hollow. There was no soul to it, no real meaning beyond the numbers. And I was hollow too, successful and miserable and too busy to notice the difference. She merged into the sparse early morning traffic. You didn't just save the Wraith Project, you saved me from becoming someone I would have hated, someone my younger self would have been ashamed of. Victoria's voice cracked slightly. So thank you for having the courage to accept an impossible challenge, for being honest when I was cruel, for showing all of us a better way. Frank was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick. My wife used to say that people are like aircraft. We're all capable of more than we think, but we need the right conditions to fly. For years, I thought my flying days were over, that I was grounded permanently by age and circumstance and bad luck. He looked out the window at the passing darkness. But you gave me the right conditions. You gave me a chance when you didn't have to. You listened when you could have dismissed me. You changed an entire company culture because you were willing to admit you'd been wrong. That's not common, Victoria. That's extraordinary. They drove in comfortable silence for a while. Victoria found herself thinking about the past month, about how much had changed and how quickly. A month ago, she'd been a CEO on the edge of failure, desperate and cruel. Now she was still desperate, but in a different way. Desperate to prove that compassion and competence could coexist, that treating people well was good business, not just good ethics. She pulled up to Frank's hotel, a modest business class place near the facility. What time should I pick you up tomorrow? You don't need to be... Frank, what time? He smiled. 9:30. I promised Emma we'd have breakfast together, and then I'd show her the hangar before the Pentagon team arrives. 9:30 it is. Get some sleep. Frank opened the door, then paused. Victoria, about tomorrow, whatever happens, we've already won something important. We've proven that change is possible. That's not nothing. It's not everything either. We need this contract. I know, and we'll give them our best. That's all we can do. He climbed out slowly, his body clearly aching. See you in the morning. Victoria watched him walk into the hotel, then sat in the parking lot for a moment, suddenly too tired to drive home. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. All systems green. Get some rest, boss. Tomorrow's the big day. She texted back. You too. And Marcus, thank you for staying, for believing. His response came quickly. Thank you for being worth believing in. Victoria finally drove home as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Beautiful and ephemeral, like hope. Monday arrived with crystal clear skies and temperatures in the low 60s, perfect flying weather. Victoria picked up Frank at exactly 9:30 and found him in the hotel restaurant with Sarah and Emma. The little girl was chattering excitedly about helicopters and grandpas and whether the Wraith could do loops like the planes she'd seen at air shows. Helicopters don't do loops, sweetie, Frank explained patiently. But they can do other things that planes can't. Want to come see? Emma's eyes went wide. Really? I can see it? If it's okay with your mom and Ms. Ashford, Sarah smiled. It's fine with me. Emma's been talking about nothing else since yesterday. Then let's go. Frank stood up, moving better after a night's rest. He was wearing his new uniform, not military, but professional. Pressed slacks, a Meridian Aerospace polo shirt with his title embroidered on it, and a lightweight jacket. He looked every inch the director he now was. They drove to the facility with Emma keeping up a constant stream of questions. How fast did the helicopter go? How loud was it? Could it fly upside down? Did Grandpa ever get scared? Frank answered each question seriously, never talking down to her, treating her curiosity with respect. Victoria found herself watching them in the rearview mirror and feeling a deep sense of rightness. This connection between grandfather and granddaughter, this reclaimed relationship, this was as important as any contract. At the facility, Emma's excitement reached new heights. The hangar seemed impossibly huge to her, and the Wraith looked like something from a movie. Frank lifted her up to look into the cockpit, explaining the controls in simple terms while she listened with rapt attention. Your grandpa is very special, Victoria told Sarah as they watched from a distance. I know, I just forgot for a while. Sarah's voice was quiet. When my mom died and he disappeared, I was so angry. I thought he'd abandoned us. I didn't understand he was drowning and didn't want us to see it. He's not drowning anymore. No, he's flying again, in more ways than one. Sarah turned to Victoria. Thank you for seeing him, for really seeing him when everyone else just saw a janitor. I didn't see him at first either. He had to force me to look. Victoria felt the familiar twist of shame. I'm not the hero in this story, Sarah. Maybe there doesn't have to be a hero. Maybe it's enough that you both found a way to be better. Sarah smiled. That's what I'm trying to teach Emma.
that making mistakes is okay as long as you fix them, that being wrong isn't the end if you're willing to learn. A car pulled into the parking lot, a black SUV with government plates. Then another, and another. The Pentagon evaluation team had arrived early. Victoria's stomach clenched. "They're here." Frank saw the vehicles and gently set Emma down. "Sweetheart, Grandpa has to work now. But you and your mom can watch from the observation room, okay? Okay, will you do the cool flying? Not today, but you'll see other pilots do amazing things." He knelt down to her level. "Emma, this is very important work. These people decide if the helicopter I helped build is good enough. So I need you to be very grown up and quiet while we work. Can you do that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I'll be so quiet they won't even know I'm there, like when you were invisible." Frank laughed and hugged her. "That's my girl." Sarah took Emma's hand and headed toward the observation area, while Victoria and Frank walked out to meet the evaluation team. 6 people emerged from the SUVs, 3 in military flight suits, 2 in business attire, and 1 older man in a suit that practically screamed senior Pentagon official. Colonel Brennan appeared from inside the facility to make introductions. "Ms.
Ashford, Colonel Jackson, this is Brigadier General Raymond Walsh, head of the Acquisition Committee. General, Victoria Ashford, CEO of Meridian Aerospace, and Colonel Frank Jackson, Director of Flight Operations." General Walsh was in his early 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of assessing gaze that missed nothing. He shook hands with both of them, his grip firm. "I've heard quite a bit about you both. Some of it from official reports, some from a very interesting video that's been circulating." Victoria's heart sank, but Frank spoke calmly. "General, we're prepared to address any concerns about that incident as part of our formal briefing." "I should hope so. That's part of why we moved the evaluation up. Needed to see firsthand if Meridian is a stable operation or a publicity stunt." Walsh's expression was unreadable. "But first, let's see this helicopter everyone's talking about. I want a full technical briefing, then we'll move to flight demonstrations." The next 2 hours were the most intense of Victoria's professional life. They walked the evaluation team through every aspect of the Wraith: design specifications, testing protocols, performance data, maintenance requirements. Marcus led the technical presentation with quiet competence, and Victoria could see the Pentagon engineers gradually shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. But it was Frank's portion of the briefing that really captured their attention. He explained the flight control philosophy, the deliberate oscillation design, the training protocols they'd developed. He was clear, concise, and utterly authoritative. This wasn't a janitor pretending to be an expert. This was an expert who'd temporarily worked as a janitor. General Walsh interrupted several times with sharp questions, and Frank answered each one without hesitation. The other military pilots in the room began nodding along, recognizing the combat flight theory behind the design. Then came the moment Victoria had been dreading. Walsh asked directly about the viral video. "Ms. Ashford, I need to understand what happened that day. Not the sanitized version, the truth. Because right now it looks like your company was in chaos until a janitor saved you. That's not the kind of stability the Pentagon needs in a long-term contractor." Victoria took a breath and made a decision. Complete honesty. No spin. "General, you're absolutely right. We were in chaos. For 3 years, we'd been failing to solve problems that should have been straightforward because our organizational culture valued credentials and hierarchy over actual competence. I personally created that culture through my leadership, or lack of it." She pulled up a slide showing the company's testing failures over time. "We had the expertise we needed already in our building. Colonel Jackson applied for an engineering position when we opened this facility, and our HR department rejected him without an interview because he was 71 years old. So he took a janitorial position because he needed the work, and for 3 years he watched us fail while possessing the exact knowledge we needed to succeed." Walsh leaned forward. "Why didn't he speak up?" "He did, sir," Frank interjected. "I wrote a detailed technical analysis 6 months ago and left it on our lead engineer's desk. It was dismissed without being read because it came from a janitor. The assumption was that someone in my position couldn't possibly have relevant expertise." Marcus spoke up, his voice steady despite obvious discomfort. That was my decision, General, and it was wrong. I let pride and assumption blind me to a valid technical solution. It's a mistake I won't make again. Victoria continued. The incident you saw on video was the breaking point.
I publicly humiliated Colonel Jackson by challenging him to fly the Wraith, thinking I was making a point about expertise. Instead, he made a point about my failures as a leader. He flew the aircraft flawlessly and exposed everything that was wrong with how we operated. She advanced to the next slide, showing the organizational changes implemented since that day. We responded by completely restructuring our culture. We implemented immediate wage corrections for underpaid employees. We established open-door policies for ideas from any level. We promoted based on competence rather than credentials alone. And yes, we gave Colonel Jackson the director position he should have been offered 3 years ago. That's quite a transformation in less than a month, Walsh said skeptically. It is. And it's been expensive, disruptive, and controversial. Victoria met his eyes. But it's also why we're suddenly succeeding. Our testing efficiency has increased by 40%. Our engineering team is solving problems in days instead of months. Our pilots are flying the Wraith to capabilities we didn't know it had. None of that happened by accident. It happened because we finally started listening to everyone, not just the people at the top. She pulled up the final slide, their performance metrics over the past month compared to the previous 3 years. General, you asked if we're stable. The answer is no. We're not stable if stable means keeping everything the same. But if stable means having systems in place to continuously improve, to recognize and fix our failures, to value every person's contribution regardless of their title, then yes, we're becoming stable in the way that actually matters. Walsh studied the data for a long moment. And what happens when the novelty wears off? When the feel-good story stops being enough to motivate people? Frank stood up. General, I've led combat units in 3 different war zones. I've trained hundreds of pilots, and I can tell you that the best teams aren't built on novelty or feel-good stories. They're built on trust, competence, and genuine respect. That's what we're building here. He gestured to the observation window where the hangar crew was visible, preparing the Wraith for flight demonstrations. Every person in this facility now believes their contribution matters. The technician who caught the turbine vibration this weekend did it because he knew he'd be listened to, not dismissed. The junior engineer who suggested a software fix did it because she wasn't afraid of being mocked. The test pilots are flying better because they're being trained rather than blamed. Frank's voice was calm but carried absolute conviction. You're right to be skeptical about sudden changes, but this isn't sudden. It's 3 years of problems finally being addressed by people who care enough to fix them. And yes, it took a dramatic moment to catalyze the change. Sometimes that's what it takes to break through institutional inertia. General Walsh was quiet, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he stood. All right, I appreciate the honesty. Now let's see if the results match the rhetoric. I want to see this helicopter fly, and I want to see it flown by military pilots, not just your experts. This was the real test. Lieutenant Kim and Rodriguez were prepared to fly, but having Pentagon pilots at the controls was different. They'd be looking for flaws, testing limits, pushing the aircraft hard to find its breaking points. Frank nodded. We expected that, sir. We have 3 of your pilots checked out and ready to fly, and Colonel Jackson will be available to answer any technical questions during the demonstrations. You're not flying it yourself? I'm 74 years old, General. I can fly it. Proved that already. But what you need to see is that younger pilots with current combat experience can fly it too. That's what makes it operationally viable. Walsh actually smiled at that. Good answer, Colonel. Let's get started. The flight demonstrations began at 1400 hours. The Pentagon pilots flew the Wraith through every scenario imaginable. High-speed maneuvers, rapid altitude changes, simulated combat situations, emergency procedures. Each pilot spent 40 minutes in the cockpit, and each one came out looking impressed and slightly exhilarated. From the observation room, Victoria watched with her heart in her throat. Sarah stood beside her with Emma, who pressed her face against the glass with wide eyes. "Grandpa made that fly?" Emma whispered in awe as the Wraith executed a particularly aggressive banking turn. "He helped make it, yes," Sarah told her daughter, "and he taught those pilots how to fly it properly." "Grandpa's smart." "Yes, sweetheart, he really is." Victoria's phone buzzed.
A text from Marcus. Telemetry is perfect. Every system performing above spec. We've got this. She wanted to believe him, but until General Walsh actually signed off, nothing was certain. The final flight test ended at 17:30. The Pentagon team huddled in a conference room for 90 minutes, while Victoria, Frank, and the Meridian leadership team waited in agonizing uncertainty. Frank sat quietly, his hand trembling slightly. Whether from nerves or fatigue, Victoria couldn't tell. Marcus paced. James stood by the window, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. At 1900 hours, Colonel Brennan emerged from the conference room. They want to see everyone. Main conference room. Now. This was it. Victoria stood on shaking legs. Frank rose more slowly, and she saw him take a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Together, they walked into the conference room where General Walsh and his team waited. Walsh stood at the head of the table, his expression grave. Ms. Ashford, Colonel Jackson, please sit. They sat. The silence stretched unbearably. I'll be direct, Walsh began. When we arrived this morning, I was prepared to disqualify Meridian from consideration. The video, the reports of organizational chaos, the concerns about stability, all of it suggested a company that wasn't ready for a major Pentagon contract. Victoria felt her heart sinking. But after today's evaluation, I have to say I was wrong. Walsh's stern expression cracked into something approaching a smile. The Wraith is an exceptional aircraft. More importantly, the team behind it is exceptional. The technical competence, the flight performance, the systematic approach to problem solving, everything we saw today demonstrated a contractor we can trust. Victoria couldn't breathe. Pending final budget approval and contract negotiations, I'm recommending Meridian Aerospace as the primary contractor for the AH-7 Wraith program. Initial order of 47 aircraft with options for up to 200 more over 5 years. The room erupted. Marcus let out a whoop. James actually smiled. Frank sat very still, his eyes closed, his weathered hands pressed flat on the table. Victoria found her voice. General, Thank you. Thank you for giving us this chance. Thank your team. They earned it. Walsh extended his hand. Congratulations, Ms. Ashford. You're about to become very busy. As hands were shaken and congratulations exchanged, Victoria looked at Frank. Tears were running down his face, but he was smiling. We did it, she whispered. You did it, he corrected. You had the courage to change everything when it mattered most. We did it together. Outside the conference room, Sarah and Emma waited. Emma broke free from her mother and ran to Frank, who scooped her up with a laugh. Did you win, Grandpa? Yes, sweetheart. We won. I knew you would. You're a superhero. Frank held his granddaughter close, and Victoria saw Sarah watching with tears in her eyes. This was what winning actually looked like. Not just contracts and money, but connections restored, dignity reclaimed, family reunited. The celebration that night was modest but genuine. The hangar crew brought in pizza and drinks. Engineers mingled with janitors, former colleagues of Frank's who were now making living wages and being treated with respect. Test pilots swapped stories with maintenance technicians. Hierarchy melted away in the shared joy of success. Victoria found herself standing with Frank near the Wraith, both of them holding plastic cups of cheap champagne. To second chances, Frank said, raising his cup. To seeing people clearly, Victoria countered. They drank, and the champagne tasted better than any expensive bottle Victoria had ever opened. What now? Frank asked. You've got a massive contract, organizational changes to continue implementing, and about 1,000 new challenges coming. Now we do the work. We build the helicopters. We honor our commitments. We prove that treating people well and running a successful business aren't mutually exclusive. Victoria paused. And you? What's next for you? I'm going to lead this flight operations team and train the best helicopter pilots in the world. And then, every other weekend, I'm going to Colorado to be the grandfather I should have been all along. Frank smiled. Turns out you can have both, meaningful work and meaningful relationships. Who knew? You did. You just forgot for a while. And you reminded me. Funny how that works. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their team celebrate.
Victoria thought about the journey that had brought them here, from cruelty to humility, from failure to success, from invisibility to recognition. It hadn't been clean or easy, and there were still mountains to climb. But they'd proven something important, that change was possible, that people mattered more than hierarchies, that dignity and competence could coexist. A month ago, Victoria had been a CEO who measured success in contracts and profits. Tonight, she was a leader who understood that real success was measured in people, valued, respected, empowered to be their best selves. It had taken a janitor with a mop and the courage to accept an impossible challenge to teach her that lesson. And she would spend the rest of her career making sure she never forgot it. 6 months after the Pentagon evaluation, Victoria stood in the same hangar where everything had changed, but now it hummed with a different energy. The space had expanded, literally, with a new wing added to accommodate increased production. But more importantly, the atmosphere had transformed from fearful silence to productive collaboration. 3 Wraith helicopters sat in various stages of assembly, surrounded by technicians and engineers working side by side. The artificial barrier between thinkers and doers had dissolved, replaced by teams that valued every perspective. A senior engineer consulted with a maintenance specialist about mounting bracket placement. A junior designer sketched modifications suggested by a 40-year veteran machinist. Frank stood near the 3rd aircraft, deep in conversation with 2 Pentagon liaison officers who'd become permanent fixtures at the facility. Victoria watched from the elevated walkway, Marcus beside her reviewing production schedules on his tablet. "We're actually ahead of schedule," Marcus said, sounding almost surprised. "First delivery is set for 3 weeks from now, and we'll beat that by at least 5 days. How's the team holding up?" "Better than expected. Morale is higher than I've ever seen it. Turnover is down to almost nothing. We've only lost 2 people in 6 months, both to retirement." Marcus looked up from his tablet. "You know what's interesting? Productivity increased even though we reduced mandatory overtime and improved work-life balance. Turns out rested, happy employees work more efficiently." "Imagine that," Victoria said dryly. "It's almost like treating people well is good for business." "Revolutionary concept," Marcus smiled. "Speaking of which, I got the quarterly financials this morning. Despite the wage corrections and benefits improvements, our operational costs are down 8% from last year." "How is that possible?" "Efficiency gains mostly. When people aren't afraid to report problems early, we catch and fix issues before they become expensive disasters. When everyone feels ownership of the project, they're more careful with resources. And when we're not constantly recruiting and training replacements for people who quit, we save massive amounts on HR costs." Victoria shook her head in wonder. "We spent 10 years doing it wrong." "We spent 10 years doing it the way everyone does it. You just had the courage to try something different." Marcus closed his tablet. "The board meeting is in an hour. You ready for it?" "As ready as I'll ever be." The quarterly board meeting had become less adversarial over the past months, but there were still skeptics, board members who viewed the cultural changes as unnecessary expenses, who wanted to return to traditional business practices now that the Pentagon contract was secure. Victoria had spent the morning preparing her presentation, armed with data that proved compassion and profitability weren't mutually exclusive. She found Frank in his office an hour before the meeting, reviewing pilot training reports. He looked healthier than he had 6 months ago. The constant stress had eased from his features, replaced by a calm confidence that came from doing work he believed in. "How's the training program?" Victoria asked. "Excellent. We've got 12 new pilots certified on the Wraith and another 20 in the pipeline. The military is so impressed they're sending their instructor pilots here to learn our methods." Frank set down his reading glasses. "Never thought I'd see the day when Meridian Aerospace became the gold standard for helicopter training. Never thought I'd see the day when I'd willingly take a pay cut and feel good about it." Frank laughed. "How's the board taking the sustained changes?" "Mixed. Thompson and Rodriguez are fully supportive. They've seen the numbers and they're believers. Patterson is still skeptical but willing to wait and see. Caldwell wants to roll everything back and return to proven methods." Victoria sat down across from him. "He's been calling other board members privately, suggesting I've lost focus on profitability." "Have you?" "No, I've gained focus on sustainability. There's a difference." Victoria pulled out her phone and showed Frank a news article. Forbes published this yesterday.
Meridian Aerospace, Can Compassionate Capitalism Actually Work? They interviewed 20 of our employees, from executives to maintenance staff. Read the quotes. Frank scrolled through the article, his expression softening as he read testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the wage corrections and cultural shifts. One of his former janitorial colleagues had been able to afford medical treatment for his wife. A single mother engineer had accessed the new child care assistance program. A young machinist had enrolled in night school using the education benefits. This is what success looks like, Frank said quietly. Not just the helicopters we build, but the lives we change while building them. Try telling that to Caldwell. He thinks anything that doesn't directly increase shareholder value is waste. Then show him the retention rates, the productivity gains, the fact that we're beating every deadline. Show him that investing in people is the best investment a company can make. Frank handed back her phone. And if he still doesn't get it, remind him that you're the CEO and he's not. Victoria smiled.
I knew there was a reason I made you director. Because I'm devastatingly charming and modest?
Because you're right about the things that matter. The board meeting began at 1400 hours in the executive conference room. 12 board members sat around the polished table, some attending virtually via video conference, their expressions ranging from supportive to hostile. Victoria stood at the head of the table with her presentation ready, Frank seated to her right as a show of unified leadership. Thank you all for coming, Victoria began. I know there have been concerns about the direction of the company over the past 6 months. Today, I want to address those concerns with data, not rhetoric. She pulled up the first slide showing revenue projections versus actuals. As you can see, we're exceeding our revenue targets by 12%. The Pentagon contract is ahead of schedule and under budget. We've received inquiries from 4 allied nations about purchasing wraiths, representing potential additional revenue of $800 million over the next 3 years. Caldwell interrupted immediately. Those are good numbers, Victoria, but they don't account for the increased labor costs from your wage corrections. You've added nearly $15 million in annual payroll expenses. That's correct. And we've saved $22 million in reduced turnover, improved efficiency, and decreased error rates. Net gain of $7 million annually. Victoria advanced to the next slide showing detailed cost analysis. When you account for the full economic impact, treating employees well is significantly more profitable than the old model. Patterson spoke up from the video screen. What about the executive compensation reductions? How are you retaining top talent when they can make more elsewhere? We've actually improved our executive retention, Victoria replied. In the past year, we've lost 0 executives to competing offers. The 3 who left did so because they disagreed with our cultural direction, and frankly, they weren't the right fit for where we're going. The executives who stayed are more engaged and productive than ever because they're part of something meaningful, not just collecting paychecks. She clicked to the next slide showing employee satisfaction surveys, productivity metrics, and innovation rates. Our employees are filing patents at 3 times the previous rate. Quality control issues are down 67%. Customer satisfaction scores are at an all-time high. These aren't soft metrics, they translate directly to competitive advantage and market position. Rodriguez, one of the supportive board members, leaned forward. Victoria, I think what some of us are wondering is whether these changes are sustainable long-term, or if we're seeing temporary gains from the novelty effect. Fair question. Let me introduce someone who can speak to that better than I can. Victoria gestured to Frank. Colonel Jackson, would you share your perspective? Frank stood, his bearing confident despite the scrutiny of the board. Ladies and gentlemen, I've served in the military for 28 years and worked in aerospace for another 15. I've seen every kind of organizational culture imaginable, from highly effective to catastrophically dysfunctional. What Victoria has built here over the past 6 months isn't novel, it's proven. He walked to the window overlooking the production floor. The military learned decades ago that the best units aren't built on fear and hierarchy alone. They're built on trust, competence, and genuine respect for every member's contribution. That's why officers eat last. That's why we promote based on merit, not just time in service. That's why we court-martial officers who abuse their authority. Frank turned back to the board. Victoria is applying those same principles here, and the results are exactly what you'd expect. Improved performance, better retention, higher morale, and stronger results. This isn't experimental. It's just unusual in corporate America because most companies prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability. Caldwell's face had reddened. Colonel Jackson, with all due respect, you've been in this position for 6 months. Some of us have been in business for decades. We know what works. You know what used to work, Frank corrected calmly. The world has changed. The workforce has changed. The expectation that talented people will accept poor treatment just for a paycheck has changed. Companies that don't adapt to that reality will lose their best people to companies that do. Are you suggesting we should run this company based on employee feelings rather than business fundamentals? I'm suggesting that employee well-being is a business fundamental. Healthy, respected, fairly compensated employees are more productive, more innovative, and more loyal. That's not feelings. That's economics. Thompson spoke up, his tone thoughtful. Victoria, let me ask directly. If we forced you to choose between maintaining these cultural changes and maximizing short-term profits, which would you choose? The room went silent. This was the crux of the debate, the fundamental question about what kind of company Meridian would be. Victoria met Thompson's eyes steadily. I would choose the cultural changes, even if it cost us short-term profits, because in the long term, there is no trade-off. Companies that treat people well outperform companies that don't. But more importantly, I didn't become CEO to build a company that makes money at the expense of human dignity. I want to build something that proves you can do both. And if the board disagrees, then I'll resign and take my vision somewhere else. Victoria's voice was firm. I'm not going back to the way we were. I've seen what that cost us in wasted talent, failed projects, and my own humanity. I won't do it again. The silence that followed was tense. Several board members exchanged glances. Caldwell looked apoplectic, but Rodriguez was nodding slowly, and Patterson's expression was thoughtful. Finally, Thompson spoke. I appreciate your conviction, Victoria, and I appreciate the data you've presented. I propose we table any discussion of rolling back the cultural changes until we have at least 18 months of data to evaluate long-term trends. Does anyone second that motion? I second, Rodriguez said immediately. All in favor? 8 hands went up. Only Caldwell and 2 others abstained. Motion carries. Victoria, you have your 18 months to prove this model works long-term. Use them well. Victoria felt relief wash over her, but she kept her expression professional. Thank you. I will. The meeting continued for another hour, covering production schedules and contract details. But the tension had eased. Victoria had won the breathing room she needed, and more importantly, she'd drawn a line in the sand about what kind of leader she would be. After the board members departed, Frank found her standing alone in the conference room, staring out the window at the production floor below. You were willing to resign, he said. Really resign, not just bluff. Yes, because going back would mean losing everything that matters. The contract, the company, the success, none of it means anything if we achieve it by treating people as disposable. Victoria turned to face him. You taught me that. When you stood up in this building and showed us who you really were, you proved that human dignity is non-negotiable. I won't forget that lesson. 18 months is a good timeline. By then, we'll have even more data showing the approach works. And if Caldwell's right? If it all falls apart? Frank smiled. Then we'll fail having tried to do something meaningful. That's better than succeeding at something hollow. The months that followed proved Victoria's approach was working. The first wraiths were delivered ahead of schedule and performed flawlessly in initial field tests. The Pentagon exercised its option for 20 additional aircraft. Allied nations signed preliminary contracts. Meridian's stock price climbed steadily as investors recognized the company's strengthened position. But the real transformations were more personal. Marcus had taken Frank's mentoring to heart and begun implementing similar cultural changes in his engineering department. The rigid hierarchy that had once stifled innovation gave way to collaborative problem-solving. Junior engineers' ideas were heard and evaluated on merit. Senior engineers admitted when they didn't know something. The result was faster innovation and better designs. James Whitmore, the skeptical VP who'd questioned Victoria's changes from the beginning, had gradually become one of their strongest advocates. He'd seen the financial benefits firsthand and recognized that his initial resistance had been based on fear rather than facts. He now championed the cultural model in industry conferences, becoming an unlikely spokesperson for compassionate capitalism. The janitorial staff, Frank's former colleagues, had been completely restructured. Wages had increased to living wage standards. Benefits included healthcare, retirement plans, and education assistance. Several former janitors had taken advantage of the education benefits to train for technical positions within the company. 2 now worked as aircraft technicians. 1 was enrolled in engineering courses. And Frank himself had found a balance he'd thought impossible. He led the flight operations team with the same competence he'd shown in the military, training the next generation of helicopter pilots while maintaining time for his family. Every other weekend, he flew to Colorado to see Sarah and Emma. He'd missed 7 years of his granddaughter's life, but he was determined not to miss any more. On a Saturday morning in late June, nearly a year after the viral video that had changed everything, Victoria received a call from Frank asking her to come to the facility. It was unusual. Frank rarely worked weekends anymore, having learned the value of rest and family time. She found him in the hangar with Sarah and Emma, who'd come to visit for the summer. Emma was 9 now, taller and more confident, chattering excitedly about something while Frank listened with patient attention. "Victoria!" Emma ran over when she saw her. "Grandpa says I can sit in a helicopter, a real one." "Does he now?" Victoria smiled at Frank. "What's the occasion?" "Well, I thought it was time Emma understood what her grandpa actually does for work. And there's someone else I wanted you to meet." Frank gestured toward the hangar entrance where 2 people were walking in, a man and a woman, both in their 40s. "Victoria Ashford, I'd like you to meet my son, Michael, and my daughter, Rebecca. They flew in last night." Victoria shook hands with both of them, seeing Frank's features reflected in their faces. Michael's steady gaze, Rebecca's quiet strength. "Your father talks about you often," Victoria said. "He talks about you too," Rebecca replied. "And about this place. We wanted to see it for ourselves, the company that gave our father back his purpose." "I think it's more accurate to say your father gave this company its purpose." They walked through the facility together, Frank narrating the changes that had occurred over the past year, the expansion, the new training center, the employee wellness programs, the childcare facility that had opened 3 months ago. Every change reflected the values they'd fought to establish, that people mattered, that dignity was non-negotiable, that success meant more than profits. As they walked, Frank's children asked questions and shared stories about the father they'd lost to grief and shame and slowly found again. Michael talked about the monthly dinners they'd started having, the whole family together for the first time in years. Rebecca described how Emma was doing in school, how she'd written an essay about her grandpa, the helicopter pilot that had won a school contest. Emma herself alternated between asking technical questions about the helicopters and performing cartwheels across the hangar floor, her joy infectious. "She's a lot like you were at that age," Michael told Frank. "Curious about everything, fearless, absolutely certain she can do anything." "Then I hope she has an easier path than I did," Frank replied. "Fewer detours, less time lost." "The detours made you who you are, Dad. And who you are is pretty remarkable." They ended up in the observation room overlooking the main production floor. 15 wraiths in various stages of assembly filled the space, each one representing not just technological achievement, but human potential realized. "I need to tell you something," Frank said, gathering his family around him. Something I should have said years ago, but was too proud and too ashamed to say. His children grew quiet, attentive. "When your mother died and I lost everything, I thought I'd failed. Failed as a husband because I couldn't save her. Failed as a provider because I couldn't pay the medical bills. Failed as a father because I had nothing left to offer you. So I disappeared. I cut you out of my life because I thought you'd be better off without seeing what I'd become." Frank's voice was thick with emotion. "But I was wrong. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting my ego. I was choosing pride over family. And I lost 8 years with you, 8 years with Emma, because I couldn't admit I needed help." Sarah took his hand. "Dad, let me finish, please." Frank looked at each of his children. "Victoria gave me back my professional life, yes. But more importantly, she taught me that admitting failure isn't weakness. It's the first step toward growth. That asking for help isn't shameful. It's wise. That being vulnerable with the people you love isn't a burden, it's a gift. He turned to include Victoria in his gaze. This past year, I've rebuilt my relationship with all of you. I've gotten to know my granddaughter. I've remembered what it means to be part of a family instead of just being alone with my pride. And that's worth more than any job title or success or recognition. Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes. We never stopped loving you, Dad. We were just waiting for you to let us back in. I know, and I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry for all the time we lost. Frank pulled his children into an embrace, and Emma squeezed between them, her small arms wrapping around her grandfather's waist. Victoria watched the reunion with her own tears falling freely. This was why everything had been worth it. Not just the successful company or the Pentagon contracts, but moments like this, families restored, dignity reclaimed, lives rebuilt. Later that evening, after Frank's family had left for dinner, Victoria found herself alone in the hangar with Frank. They stood beneath the first production Wraith, the one that bore a small plaque. AH-7 Wraith, production serial 001, first flight demonstrated by Colonel Frank Jackson. Thank you, Frank said quietly. For what? For seeing me. For taking a cruel joke and turning it into an opportunity for change. For being brave enough to admit your mistakes and strong enough to fix them. Victoria shook her head. Frank, you saved this company. You saved me from becoming someone I would have hated. If there's gratitude owed, I owe it to you. Then let's call it even. Two people who were lost finding their way back to who they were supposed to be. Deal. Victoria extended her hand and Frank shook it firmly. They stood in comfortable silence, looking at the helicopter that represented so much more than engineering achievement. It represented proof that change was possible, that dignity mattered, that people's worth wasn't defined by their job titles, but by their character and competence. What happens next? Frank asked. You've got 18 months to prove the model works long term. What's the plan? Keep doing what we're doing. Treat people well. Build great helicopters. Show the world that compassionate capitalism isn't just possible, it's superior. Victoria paused. And document everything. Because when this works, and it will work, I want other companies to see the roadmap. I want to prove that you don't have to choose between profitability and humanity. Ambitious. Learn from the best. Victoria smiled. You taught me to think bigger than quarterly earnings, to measure success in lives changed, not just dollars earned, to lead with integrity even when it's uncomfortable. I taught you to fly the helicopter properly. The rest you figured out yourself. Maybe, but having a good teacher helps. Frank's phone buzzed. He checked it and smiled. Emma wants to know if she can come back tomorrow to see the helicopters again. Says she's decided she wants to be a pilot when she grows up. Like her grandfather. Hopefully better than her grandfather. Smarter about balancing work and family. Wiser about asking for help. Less stubborn about admitting mistakes. So basically, learning from your example while avoiding your mistakes. That's what each generation should do. Stand on the shoulders of the one before and reach a little higher. Victoria looked around the hangar at the aircraft being built by teams that valued every member, at the facility that had transformed from a place of fear to a place of purpose, at the legacy they were creating together. I think we've built something worth standing on, she said. Something strong enough to support the next generation. I think you're right. The following months proved them both correct. The 18-month evaluation period Thompson had proposed passed with consistent positive results. Employee retention remained high. Productivity continued to improve. Innovation rates exceeded industry standards. The Pentagon contracted for additional Wraiths and began discussions about developing a next-generation platform with Meridian as the lead contractor. More companies began reaching out, wanting to understand Meridian's cultural model. Victoria started giving keynote speeches at business conferences, sharing the story of transformation with brutal honesty, including her own failures and the janitor who'd taught her to see clearly. The story resonated. Some dismissed it as feel-good nonsense, but others recognized it as a genuine roadmap for sustainable success. 3 Fortune 500 companies implemented similar cultural reforms. A dozen smaller firms adopted Meridian's training and compensation models. The movement was small but growing. Frank's training program became legendary in military aviation circles. Pilots who'd trained under him went on to instruct others, spreading his methods throughout the helicopter community. The techniques he'd developed for flying the Wraith were adapted for other platforms. His name became synonymous with excellence in combat aviation training, but perhaps the most meaningful change was the least visible. Throughout Meridian Aerospace, people walked with their heads higher. The janitors didn't just clean, they contributed ideas for improving workspace efficiency. The engineers didn't just design, they listened to input from machinists and technicians. The executives didn't just direct, they served the teams beneath them. The hierarchy still existed, but it was based on competence and contribution rather than just credentials and seniority. And everyone, regardless of position, was treated with the fundamental dignity every human being deserved. 2 years after the viral video, Victoria stood in front of the entire company at their annual meeting. Nearly 300 employees filled the expanded facility, with hundreds more attending virtually. She looked out at faces she now knew by name. Not just executives and engineers, but maintenance workers, and administrative staff, and the security guards, and everyone who made the company function. 2 years ago, Victoria began, we were failing, not just technically, but morally. We'd built a culture where some people mattered and others didn't, where titles meant more than talent, where we valued credentials over character. She clicked to a photo of Frank in his janitorial coveralls, mop in hand. And then, one Friday afternoon, I made a terrible mistake. I publicly mocked this man. I challenged him to fly a helicopter as a joke, thinking I was making a point about expertise. Instead, he made a point about my failures as a leader. The room was silent, everyone familiar with the story, but still riveted by hearing Victoria tell it. Colonel Frank Jackson accepted my cruel challenge, and in doing so, he exposed everything that was wrong with how we operated. He proved that we'd been overlooking talent, ignoring wisdom, wasting potential, all because we couldn't see past job titles to actual human worth. Victoria advanced to the next slide showing the company's transformation metrics. Since that day, everything has changed. We've tripled our revenue. We've won contracts worth over $2 billion. We've expanded our workforce by 40%. We've become the gold standard in helicopter design and manufacturing. She paused. But none of that is what I'm most proud of. What I'm most proud of is this. We did it while treating people with dignity. We did it while paying fair wages. We did it while valuing every contribution from every position. We proved that you don't have to choose between being successful and being decent. Applause rippled through the crowd. Today, I want to announce several new initiatives that continue this commitment. First, we're establishing the Frank Jackson Scholarship Fund, which will provide full tuition assistance for employees or their children pursuing education in aerospace, engineering, or any field that helps them reach their potential. Frank, sitting in the front row, looked startled. Victoria smiled at him. Second, we're implementing a profit-sharing program that ensures when the company does well, everyone benefits, not just executives and shareholders. Third, we're creating an innovation fund where any employee can submit ideas and receive resources to develop them, regardless of their position or department. The applause grew louder. These changes represent millions of dollars of investment. Some people will say it's too much, that we're being naive, that we're not maximizing shareholder value. To those people, I say this: we're maximizing human value. And in the long run, that creates more sustainable profit than any short-term cost-cutting ever could. Victoria clicked to the final slide, a photo of the entire company taken the previous month. 2 years ago, a janitor saved this company by accepting an impossible challenge. Today, we honor that courage by committing ourselves to never stop challenging assumptions, never stop seeing people clearly, and never stop believing that dignity and success can coexist. She looked directly at Frank. Thank you, Colonel Jackson, for teaching us what leadership really means, for showing us that worth isn't defined by title but by character, for having the courage to be seen when the world had made you invisible. The entire room stood, applauding. Frank rose slowly, his weathered face reflecting emotion as his colleagues, his friends, honored him with genuine respect and gratitude. That evening, Victoria and Frank sat on the hangar roof watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. It had become a tradition of sorts, these quiet moments where they reflected on the journey they'd shared. You didn't have to do the scholarship fund, Frank said, though I appreciate it more than I can say. I wanted to, because the problem you faced, having expertise but being dismissed because of age or circumstance. It's not unique to you. There are talented people everywhere who just need a chance. Now we can give them one. It's a good legacy. Speaking of legacy, I heard Michael talking about you retiring. Is that something you're considering? Frank was quiet for a moment. Eventually, not yet. I've still got too much to teach, too many pilots to train, but someday, yes. I'll step back and let the next generation take over. And what will you do then? Spend time with my family, travel with Sarah and Emma. Maybe write a book about flight dynamics, though who'd read it I have no idea. Mostly just enjoy being alive and connected to the people I love. Sounds like a good plan. What about you? You've built something remarkable here. What's next for Victoria Ashford? Victoria considered the question. I want to scale this model, show other companies that it works. Maybe start consulting, helping other organizations transform their cultures. There's so much unnecessary suffering in the business world. Talented people being overlooked, workers being exploited, potential being wasted. If we can change that even a little, it's worth the effort. You've changed a lot from the person who threw me that challenge 2 years ago. I'm still changing, still learning. You taught me that growth never stops, that admitting mistakes is strength, that real leadership is service. Victoria turned to look at him. I'm grateful for that lesson, Frank. I'm grateful for you. The gratitude is mutual. You gave me back my life, my family, my purpose. That's not a small thing. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank toward the horizon. Around them, the facility hummed with quiet activity. The night shift arriving, the security team making rounds, the maintenance crew performing scheduled checks. All of them people whose lives had been touched by the transformation that began with a cruel joke and a courageous response. Do you ever think about that Friday? Victoria asked. Wonder what would have happened if you'd refused the challenge. All the time. I'd probably still be mopping floors, still be estranged from my family, still be invisible. You'd probably still be running the company the old way, still be miserable even while succeeding. Frank paused. Sometimes the worst moments create the best opportunities. We just have to be brave enough to seize them. I'm glad you were brave. I'm glad you were willing to change. The sun touched the horizon, and for a moment everything was bathed in golden light. The helicopters in the hangar, the facility they'd built together, the future they'd created through courage and honesty, and the fundamental belief that every person deserved dignity. Victoria thought about the journey that had brought them here, from humiliation to redemption, from failure to success, from isolation to connection. It hadn't been easy. It had required admitting mistakes, changing deeply ingrained patterns, standing up to critics who said it couldn't work. But it had worked. Against all odds and conventional wisdom, treating people well and running a successful business had proven compatible. They'd built something that mattered, something that would outlast them both. Thank you, Victoria said quietly, for everything. Thank you, Frank replied, for seeing me. And there, on the roof of Meridian Aerospace, as the sun set on another day, two people who'd found redemption in the most unlikely circumstances sat together in peaceful satisfaction. The janitor who'd become a director, the CEO who'd learned humility. Two lives transformed by the courage to be honest, to change, to believe that people mattered more than positions. Below them, the facility hummed with purpose. Around them, the sky blazed with color. Before them, a future built on dignity and competence stretched endlessly. They'd started with a cruel joke and an impossible challenge. They'd ended with a company transformed, lives restored, and proof that the most radical act in business was simply treating people like human beings. It was enough. It was everything. And as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to emerge, Victoria and Frank sat together in grateful silence, knowing they'd found something rare and precious. Not just success, but meaning. Not just achievement, but purpose. Not just survival, but genuine human connection. The janitor's challenge had been accepted. The CEO's transformation was complete. And the story of what happened when dignity met opportunity would echo through Meridian Aerospace and beyond for generations to come, a reminder that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and given the chance to fly.